The fluorescent light above mat 3 flickered twice before it died. He noticed because every eye in Iron Harbor Combat Club was locked on the floor. Brandon Kade, 220 pounds of tattooed ego and regional championship belts, had a 19-year-old boy's wrist twisted behind his back at an angle that made 3 grown men look away. The boy wasn't tapping. He was too scared to remember he could. And across the room, behind a rolling mop bucket that smelled like pine cleaner and rust, a 52-year-old maintenance man with a bad leg and a gray work shirt slowly stopped moving. He watched. He calculated. And somewhere behind those quiet, unreadable eyes, something that had been sleeping for a very long time began to wake up. If you've never seen the most dangerous man in a room, pretend to be invisible. You're about to subscribe now and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit that like button, and don't you dare look away. Greyhaven, Ohio arrived ugly in August. The kind of ugly that didn't announce itself. No dramatic thunderstorms, no cinematic heat shimmer off cracked asphalt. Just a slow, oppressive humidity that settled into everything like a tenant who'd stopped paying rent and knew you couldn't afford a lawyer. The air tasted like mowed grass and car exhaust, and something older underneath, something industrial that the town had never fully sweated out even after the last factory closed. Strip Mall on Route 9 sat a quarter-mile past the Sunoco station, wedged between a closed nail salon and a tax preparer that was only open 4 months a year. 6 units, half of them dark, one of them, Unit 4, the biggest one blazed with light at 4:47 in the morning, while the rest of Greyhaven was still unconscious. The sign above Unit 4 read, Iron Harbor Combat Club in aggressive block letters, red on black, with a stylized anchor that someone had clearly paid real money to design. The anchor was supposed to communicate toughness, permanence, kind of gym that had roots. What it actually communicated, to anyone paying attention, was that the owner had never been to a harbor. Silas Mercer had been to plenty. He guided the mop bucket through the side entrance at 4:51, the way he always did service door, the front, because Brandon Kade had been very specific about that the first week. The front door is for members. Members pay. You clean. Silas had nodded the same way. He nodded at everything Brandon told him, which was the nod of a man who has stopped being surprised by people who confuse volume with authority. Bucket's left wheel had a wobble. It had been wobbling for 3 weeks. Silas had mentioned it to the supply manager twice, received a, "Yeah, I'll look into it" both times, and had since stopped mentioning it. He intervened. He compensated automatically, a slight leftward pressure on the handle that corrected the drift without thought, the way you compensate for anything that's been broken long enough. He started at the back, the way he always started locker rooms first, the open mat area, the weights, the front desk, and lobby last. Systematic, the kind of routine that let his mind go somewhere else while his hands did the work. His mind, most mornings, didn't go anywhere particularly interesting. That was the point. The locker room smelled like wet towel and that specific brand of body spray that young men believed made them smell like success. Silas ran the mop across the tile floor in long, even strokes, wrung it out in the bucket, ran it again. Protein bar wrapper near the second bench, an empty energy drink and under the locker's grape flavor by the smell. Someone's forgotten mouthguard on the sink ledge, still in the case, which was either forgetfulness or superstition, and Silas had learned not to judge either one. He worked without music, no earbuds, no phone propped against the cleaning cart. Some of the other maintenance guys at his company wore headphones the whole shift, lived inside podcasts and playlists, used sound to paper over the hours. Silas understood the impulse. He'd tried it in the early months after he'd taken this kind of work. True crime podcast, 3 episodes in, before he'd realized he was critiquing the investigative methodology out loud to an empty hallway and had put the phone away permanently. Silence suited him better. In silence, you heard things. By 5:30, he was working the main mat area. The mats were the nicest thing in the building, thick, interlocking foam sections in black and red, Brandon Kade's colors, with the Iron Harbor logo printed in the center of the largest section. They were expensive. Silas had looked them up once, not because he was impressed, but because understanding what people spent money on told you what they valued. Those mats told him Brandon valued appearances, specifically how the gym looked on camera. There were 4 camera angles in this room alone, all of them facing the mat, them facing the weights or the conditioning area in back. The actual difficult work happened away from any lens. Silas mopped around the mat's edge without stepping on it. Gym policy shoes off on the mat, period. He respected the policy not because Brandon had written it on a laminated card near the entrance, but because it was a reasonable policy, and he'd spent enough of his life in spaces with clear rules about footwear to have the habit drilled down somewhere below conscious thought. He was wringing out the mop when the front door opened and the first early morning member came in. The guy's name was Cole, mid-20s, thick through the shoulders, always wore the same faded Michigan State shirt. Cole was one of the serious ones, here every morning before the main crowd, which Silas had noted early on as a distinguishing characteristic. People who trained hardest at Iron Harbor never seemed to be the ones who talked loudest. No. Cole barely said anything to anyone. He just hit the bags, worked his footwork, and left. Nodded at Silas the way he nodded at the equipment, which was fine. Silas didn't need to be spoken to, but he watched Cole's footwork while he worked. Couldn't help it. The habit was old enough to be structural. Cole had a good left side. His right leg lagged about a beat behind his pivot, which was a small thing, almost invisible, but it would cost him if he ever went against someone who was specifically patient enough to wait for it. It was the kind of flaw that training partners eventually stopped seeing because they'd adjusted to it, and opponents with fresh eyes would find in the first 30 seconds. Silas said nothing. He wrung out the mop and moved to the next section. The gym filled up properly around 6:15. Wednesday morning, which was a heavier day than Monday or Tuesday, the intermediate class ran from 6:30 to 8, which pulled in a dozen members who were past beginner basics but hadn't yet earned spots in the evening advanced sessions. They came in talking in pairs mostly, the social architecture of any gym, the training partners, friends, the guy who always showed up alone and attached himself to the nearest group with the specific desperation of someone who needed the gym to be more than exercise. That last guy this particular Wednesday was Eli Dawson. Silas had been watching Eli for 6 weeks, not in any deliberate way, more the way you watch weather. Eli was simply the kind of person that a certain type of trained eye tracked automatically, because everything about Eli's body language announced that he expected something bad to happen and simply waiting to find out what form it would take today. 19 years old, maybe 160 pounds with his gear on, with the kind of lean build that looked smaller than it was because he carried his shoulders wrong-rounded forward, chin slightly down. The physical vocabulary of someone who'd learned that making himself smaller reduced the chances of being noticed. He had a decent face, the kind that would be more confident in 10 years if life went right, and careful dark eyes that cataloged the room when he came in, a fast sweep that he probably didn't know he was doing. Silas recognized the sweep. He'd trained people to do that sweep in places where failing to do it could get you killed. On Eli, it was anxiety, not training, but the mechanics were identical. Kid had been coming to Iron Harbor for about 3 months, from what Silas could piece together. He'd started in the beginner class and gotten bumped to intermediate faster than most, which meant either genuine aptitude or a convenient opening in the class roster. Silas suspected both. He trained with everything he had, which was admirable. His technique was uneven, which was expected. What was less expected, and what had drawn Silas's quiet attention, was that Eli seemed to get visibly worse whenever Brandon Kade was in the room. Just nervous. Worse, like the presence of the gym's owner scrambled something in his signal. Silas had seen before too. In different contexts, higher stakes, but the same fundamental problem, a person who had the physical tools but couldn't access them under pressure, because pressure had been taught to them as a precursor to pain. Brandon Kade arrived at 7:45. He always arrived between 7:30 and 8, late enough to miss the quiet early work, early enough to dominate the pre-class energy. Came in through the front door with the specific force of a man who had decided long ago that entrances were performances and practiced his accordingly. Today's entrance included a phone call he'd go in until he was fully inside, and several people had already noticed him, which was probably the point. Tell him I said the rate is non-negotiable. That's literally what non-negotiable means. He cut the call abruptly, mid-sentence, like the person on the other end had ceased to exist. Pocketed the phone, scanned the room with the proprietary satisfaction of a landlord. Brandon Kade was 38, which he'd somehow turned into an asset, experienced veteran, the guy who'd fought his way to 3 regional titles in 2 different weight classes before a knee injury ended his competitive career. The living proof that Iron Harbor produced real fighters. He was big, 220 in good shape, with the kind of physical confidence that came from 20 years of being the most dangerous person in most rooms he'd walked into. He kept his head shaved, had a sleeve of tattoos on his left arm that included his championship dates and what appeared to be a compass, and wore gear that probably cost more than Silas's monthly rent. He was also, in Silas's considered professional opinion, one of the most legitimately dangerous unarmed fighters that he'd ever personally assessed. That assessment did not prevent Silas from finding him deeply unimpressive as a human being. Eli, Brandon's voice cut across the floor without effort. He didn't raise it, he didn't need to. The room had a way of quieting when he spoke that had been trained into it over years. You're on the back mat today. I'm watching your guard work. Eli, who had been stretching in the far corner, looked up. Something in his face reorganized itself, that particular kind of internal bracing. Yes, sir. Brandon had already looked away. That was the thing Silas had noticed earliest about how Brandon operated. The acknowledgement, if you could call it that, was always incomplete. He'd issue an instruction, a critique, a command, and then withdraw his attention before you could respond fully, leaving the other person to complete the interaction with empty air. It was subtle, it was effective, and it was almost certainly deliberate because it kept everyone perpetually off balance, always working to earn a follow-through that never quite came. It was a control technique, old one. Silas had seen it applied in contexts where the power differential was absolute and the consequences were lethal. Watching it deployed in a strip mall gym to intimidate a teenage boy made something at the back of his jaw tighten. He pushed the mop bucket toward the weight area and kept his eyes on the floor. The Wednesday intermediate class ran 45 minutes of drilling before open sparring. Silas worked the perimeter weights, then the conditioning area, then back to the lobby, moving in the methodical circuit that kept him present in the building without being visible in it. This was not something he'd ever articulated to himself as a strategy. It was simply what his habits had settled into. And habits, in his experience, were frequently smarter than their owners. He was remopping a section near the water fountain that someone had dripped protein shake on when the class broke to water break, and Eli Dawson appeared 6 feet to his left, bending over the fountain. Silas had been watching the kid's footwork for 40 minutes. Problem wasn't the kid's hands. His hands were fine, quick actually, quick enough that a better coach would have spotted it earlier. Problem was weight distribution. Ellie was loading his front foot about 6%, but he should have been 50-50, which meant his lateral movement was costing him half a beat to initiate, which meant anyone patient enough to feint left was going to find a door every single time. In a controlled drill, against partners who were themselves imperfect, it didn't show. Against someone who knew what to look for and wasn't feeling charitable, it would be a problem. Silas looked at the fountain, looked at Eli, made a calculation he hadn't entirely decided to make until it was already made. You're leaning? Eli straightened from the fountain and looked around, apparently checking whether the comment was directed at him. Finding no other candidate, he looked at Silas. Sorry? Your weight. You're loading the front foot too much. Means your first lateral step is always a half beat slow. Silas said it the same way. He might have said the paper towels are in the third cabinet. Information. No performance attached. Eli looked at his feet. Back at Silas. His expression was doing something complicated. The instinct to dismiss whatever a janitor told him. Fighting with the part of him that had been watching his own footwork feel wrong for 3 months, without being able to name why. How would you? He started again. You've been watching us train? Clean the floor you train on. Yes, a beat. Okay, Eli said carefully. So what do I do about it? Silas set down the mop handle, walked over to a clear section of floor, stood in a neutral stance. Feet shoulder width, weight equal. 40-pound test Somion pushes your shoulder right now. You shouldn't tip either direction. Eli, visibly as uncertain about the transaction he'd entered into, arranged his feet. Silas watched, reached out and put 2 fingers on Eli's right shoulder blade, applied about 10 pounds of pressure. Eli's weight compensation went right. There, Silas said, removing his hand. A long moment. Eli reset his feet, tried to find center. Silas watched the tiny adjustments, the micro-corrections, and said nothing because nothing was the right thing to say while someone was figuring out their own proprioception. After about 20 seconds, something in Eli's stance went still in a different way. Eli said quietly, "Yeah, that's a lot different." "It is." Silas picked up the mop handle. The water break had another 90 seconds in it, maybe. He'd said enough. Eli turned. "Thanks. I'm Eli." "Silas, you train?" "Not anymore." And then the class whistle called Eli back to the mat, and Silas returned to the fountain, and 2 minutes later neither of them appeared to have spoken at all. But Silas had noticed something during those 90 seconds. He'd been watching Eli's eyes, which was an old habit. You watched eyes not for truth, exactly, but for tracking what someone's attention moved to, and in what order, told you more than what they said. While Eli had been processing the weight adjustment, his eyes had flickered twice to the far corner of the mat, where Brandon Kade was standing with 2 of the senior students, and each time they'd flickered there, correction Eli had just achieved had gotten slightly worse before he caught it. Pavlovian. Brandon's presence was a physical disruption to Eli's mechanics. Silas knew what that meant. He'd processed it and set it aside before he'd even fully articulated it to himself, because articulating it meant deciding what to do with it, and he wasn't sure yet that it was his problem. He worked until 9:15, when the class ended and the morning crowd filtered out, and the gym settled into the quiet mid-morning state that he preferred. A couple of serious members grinding through solo work, the heavy bags moving, clock on the wall, ticking over the baseline noise of the building. He was loading the cleaning cart to go when he passed mat 3. Eli was still there, not training, standing in the middle of the mat with his hands at his sides, staring at the floor. Stance of someone having a conversation with themselves that wasn't going well. Silas kept walking, loaded the cart, signed the daily log at the front desk. Mara Vance, the morning receptionist, looked up from her phone long enough to slide the log back and return to her screen. He was at the service door when he heard Eli's bag hit the mat. Not dropped, thrown, and then nothing. Silas stood at the door for a moment. Then he set the cart inside the storage room, went back to the main floor, and pulled a folding chair to the edge of mat 3. "Sit down," he said. Eli, startled, he hadn't heard Silas come back, turned. His jaw was tight. His eyes were a specific shade of held together that Silas recognized from many contexts, none of them good. "I'm fine. You threw your gear," Silas said. "Sit down." They sat at the edge of the mat, Eli on the floor with his back against the wall, Silas in the chair. The gym was empty enough that their voices didn't need to carry anywhere. "Advanced sparring is Friday," Eli said. Not to Silas, really. More to the floor. "Brandon said I'm in. He said I'm ready to see what I'm made of." "What do you think he meant by that?" Eli looked up. "Think he meant he's going to use me to remind everyone what he's capable of." Quiet. "He does it," continued, yet was a flatness in his voice that was worse than anger, because anger at least had heat in it. "He does it every couple of months. With someone different. He picks whoever he thinks. He picks whoever makes him feel like he needs to prove something. And then Friday night, in the advanced class, in front of everyone, he stopped. Last time it was Marcus, and Marcus is actually good. And Brandon just took him apart, slowly, like it was instructional. And everyone watched. And Marcus left the gym after that? Eli blinked. Yeah. How did people leave after those things? I don't want to leave, Eli said it quietly. I actually like training here. I like the structure. He stopped again, jaw working. Just don't want to be the story he tells next month. When that scared kid from the intermediate class. What do you think you're going to do about it? The question landed differently than Eli expected, apparently. He'd anticipated either sympathy or advice, and this was neither. Processed it. I don't know. Try not to look stupid. That's not a plan. I know. Silas leaned back in the chair. Looked at the ceiling, which had a water stain in the upper left corner that had been there since his first week. What your actual problem is in sparring, not the weight thing. You're trying to win. He looked back at Eli. You haven't learned anything yet. You're in training. You shouldn't be trying to win. You should be trying to learn. The second you make it about winning, you've already handed whoever you're facing a tool to use against you. Because now they know what you want. Eli frowned. But you're supposed to try to win. In competition, yes. In training, the goal is to get better. They're not the same goal. And people who confuse them. He shrugged. They stay the same for years while they're technically getting a lot of reps in. Pause. That's what I've been doing, Eli said. It wasn't a question. That's what everyone in this room has been doing, Silas said. Because the guy running the room has built the whole thing around performance. How it looks, what it signals, not what it builds. Eli was quiet for a long moment. Were you a trainer? Before he gestured vaguely at Silas's work shirt. Before this, Silas stood up. Work on your weight distribution. Get the 50-50 centered before Friday. That's the one thing you can actually control. Picked up the folding chair, returned it to the wall, and walked back to the storage room. Eli watched him go and didn't ask anything else. The name Iron Harbor Combat Club had a story, like every name in a business like this had a story. And Silas had heard it from 3 different sources, which meant he had 3 different versions, and probably one truth somewhere in the middle. Brandon Kade had grown up about 40 minutes south, small town, rough circumstances. Everybody in the gym knew this, because Brandon circled back to it in motivational speeches, the way a tongue circles back to a sore tooth. Self-made, fought his way out. No support, no money, no advantages. The story was compelling, because it was almost certainly true in its structural shape, if the texture had been sanded down to something more cinematic with each retelling. He'd competed under the gym name Iron Harbor for 6 years before he opened the actual club, first out of a rented warehouse space, then here, in this strip mall, with the expensive mats and the 4 camera angles and the name on the sign. 3 regional titles, 1 near miss at a national qualifier, then the knee. Surgery, rehab, the pivot to coaching and gym ownership that he'd managed to frame as a choice rather than a forced landing. Silas had done some basic arithmetic in his first 2 weeks. The gym had his count by his Pearl approximately 40 active members, paying $130 a month, some of them on reduced rates. 2 classes a day, 6 days a week, 1 part-time reception person, a cleaning contract through the agency Silas worked for, and whatever Brandon paid himself from what remained. It was not a business model with a lot of margin for error. It was important context, Silas thought, for understanding why Brandon performed the way he performed. A man who owned something that could collapse under him at any moment was a man with a specific kind of fear working behind his eyes at all times. That fear needed somewhere to go, and the specific architecture of a combat gym, the natural hierarchy, the visible display of physical dominance, the audience of people who'd come specifically to see strength gave that fear a very efficient outlet. Understanding this didn't produce sympathy exactly, but it produced a kind of clarity that was close enough to useful. Thursday was quiet. Silas worked the morning shift, 5 to 11, and then a second partial shift at another facility across town from 1 to 4. His company covered 3 buildings in a rotating weekly pattern. While he'd never been asked his preference, they'd settled him into this particular rhythm, Iron Harbor mornings, office building afternoons, because he showed up on time and didn't complain, and the work got done right, which was apparently a rare enough combination to make him worth keeping in a predictable slot. The afternoon building was a 3-story insurance office. Clean, climate-controlled, low drama. People in business casual who were politely invisible to maintenance staff. Silas cleaned the bathrooms on all 3 floors, and the conference rooms on 2, and the lobby on 1, and was done by 4:15, which left him 40 minutes before his bus. He sat on a bench outside the building's side entrance in the heavy August afternoon, and ate a sandwich he'd packed that morning turkey, mustard, no nonsense, and watched the parking lot. Thought about Eli Dawson. Specifically, he thought about what Eli's situation actually required, and whether what Silas had already done, the 2-finger balance correction, the brief conversation, was going to make it worse. This was a calculation he'd made in more explicit terms over the course of many years. Is this intervention going to produce a better outcome than no intervention? And what are the downstream consequences of either choice? The honest answer was that he didn't know. Eli, going into Friday's advanced sparring session, with better weight distribution and a slightly clearer conceptual framework for what training was supposed to accomplish, would help him marginally. It wouldn't protect him from a determined, experienced, 220-pound man who had decided that Eli's public humiliation would serve a purpose. Was the part Silas kept coming back to. Not could Eli handle Friday. Eli was going to get hurt on Friday, probably not seriously, probably not in any way the gym could be held accountable for, but hurt in the specific way that Brandon's sessions left their marks, which was not usually physical. Question was what happened after. If Eli survived Friday intact technically, emotionally, and came back the following week with the thing intact that made him want to keep training, then whatever happened on Friday had a purpose. Painful, but purposeful. Some things you couldn't shortcut. If Friday broke something in Eli, that didn't come back. Silas finished the sandwich, folded the wax paper carefully. Put it in the paper bag. Put the paper bag in the bin beside the bench. Took the bus home gnome. Did his exercises on the apartment floor. Nothing theatrical. A set of joint mobility work and some low-load strength patterns that he'd built around the limitations of a left knee that had been through too many things in too many places to respond well to heavy loading anymore. And went to sleep at 9:30. He dreamed about a radio frequency he hadn't thought about in years, and woke at 3:52 in the dark, heart completely steady, and lay there for a while, with the ceiling. That happened sometimes. He got up at 4:15, made coffee, and went to work. The advanced sparring class ran at 7 in the evening. Silas's shift ended at 6. He had paperwork to sign out at the front desk, the daily log and a supply request for a replacement mop head that had been due for 2 weeks. Mara Vance was at the desk, her second shift of the day, and she was visibly not in a good mood, which Silas registered and did not probe. The gym was filling up differently tonight. The regular advanced class had 12 members. Silas counted 21 people in the building as he collected his cart and walked his final some of them, clearly not regulars, younger guys who moved with the specific energy of people who'd come to seize something rather than train. Someone had told someone, and that someone had told others. Friday night exhibitions at Iron Harbor had a word-of-mouth circuit that Silas had noted before, without caring about it, because before it had not been his problem. He found Eli near the water fountain again, tape on his hands, headphones around his neck but not in his ears. The posture of someone who'd wanted to tune out but couldn't. "How's the weight distribution?" Silas asked, not stopping. Eli looked up. Something in his face shifted. Not relief exactly, but recognition. "I think. Tried to drill it on my own last night. Don't try to think about it in there. Either it's there or it isn't. Thinking about it will make it worse. That's extremely unhelpful advice. It's accurate advice. Silas kept moving. He was almost to the storage room when Eli said, behind him, "Hey, Silas." What if I'm just not? Eli's voice was working against something. What if the reason he picks people like me isn't just to show off? What if it's because people like me are actually just not built for this? Silas turned around. Eli was looking at him with the specific expression of someone who had been working up to asking a real question for enough that the question had worn itself down to its bones. "What do you think you're built for?" Silas asked. "That's okay." He meant it. "You're 19. You're not supposed to know yet. You're here to find out. That's what this is for." He paused. "What's not for what you're using it for right now is to prove something to a man who has already decided what you are." A long moment. "You can't win that game," Silas said. "By his rules. Not tonight." "So what do I do?" Silas looked at him for a moment. Then breathe. "Move. When he comes at you hard, don't brace redact. Make him work. Stay in the game longer than he expects. That's all. Try to beat him. Make him work. That's it? That's enough." He turned back to the storage room. Behind him, he heard Eli exhale long, slow, the sound of someone trying to believe something. Yes, he had intervened. Brandon Kade's voice carried from the mat across the whole building, warming up the room, working the crowd that had assembled. Silas locked the storage room, collected his jacket, and headed for the side exit. He was 17 feet from the door when he heard the sound. A shout, not a crash. Something quieter and worse than both, a single flat thud from the mat, and then a silence that had the wrong shape to it. Silas knew what that shape meant. He'd been in enough rooms when that silence happened to know its weight. He stopped. The door was right there, 15 feet. Less, he stood with his hand not quite touching the push bar, and listened to the quality of the silence. Then Brandon Kade's voice said, loud and deliberate, and designed to carry to every corner of the room, "Get up." I said, "Get up. You tap, you show me you're done, or you stand up, and you try again. That's it. Those are the two options. You hearing me?" And Silas heard the nothing that followed, and Silas heard the nothing that followed. The nothing of a young man on the floor in front of 20 people, in a room where he'd come to learn something, lying in the silence of someone who couldn't remember how to answer. Silas's hand dropped from the push bar. He stood there for a long moment. Then he set his jacket down on the shelf beside the door, reached up and took off his work gloves, one finger at a time, and laid them on top of the jacket. Bent down, fingers finding the laces of his boots, old ones, steel toe, the kind that took time, and unlaced them with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything, set them beside the jacket. The room beyond the storage area wall had filled with that specific crowd sound, the held breath of people who wanted to intervene and had not yet decided that they would. Silas straightened. He rolled his right shoulder, then his left. Something in his neck made a sound that hadn't been there 10 years ago. His left knee registered the coolness of the concrete through his work socks. Thought about the 7 years he'd spent running some close-quarters battle scenarios in buildings that weren't supposed to exist on any publicly acknowledged map. Thought about the names of the men and women he'd trained, most of whom were still alive, some of whom were not, and the understanding he'd arrived at, very slowly and at significant personal cost, that the line between protective violence and destructive violence was not as wide as anyone wanted it to be, and that the only way to walk it well was to know exactly where you were standing before you moved. He thought about what he was about to do. Then he pushed through the door into the main gym. The mop was still leaning against the wall beside the mat where he'd left it. Eli was on the floor, not unconscious, injured, down with his right hand pressed flat against the mat, and his left arm braced, working to get up, and the expression on his face was the one that Silas had hoped not to see tonight. One past fear, past pain, the specific expression of someone in the process of being convinced that this is what they are. 21 people in the room. Brandon Kade standing over Eli, touching him now. He needing to, with the easy confidence of a man who understood leverage in all its forms. Brandon turned his head and saw Silas standing at the edge of the mat. He looked at the work socks, at the folded-up sleeves, at the complete absence of the mop that was supposed to be in Silas's hands. Brandon Kade's expression moved through confusion, assessment, and landed somewhere between amusement and contempt. "Can I help you?" he said. The room laughed, some of it. All of it. Silas stepped onto the mat. His left knee did not prevent him from moving with the kind of quiet intention that made 4 people in the front row step back without deciding to. "He's done," Silas said. His voice was the same as it always was. Performance in it. No anger for tonight. Brandon stared at him. Brandon said, slowly, like he was explaining something to someone who'd come in late, "The hell are you?" The room went quiet in a new way. Silas looked at him and said nothing, because he had not been asked a question he needed to answer. Brandon's smile came back sharper this time, with something working underneath it that Silas recognized as the specific smile of a man realizing the night had just offered him something even better than what he'd planned. Brandon said, and rolled his neck. "All right, let's see what." He moved first, the way dangerous men always moved first, because they had learned that the first move was power. Silas moved second, and everything that happened next took less time than it takes to tell. Brandon moved, the way experienced fighters always moved when they believed the outcome was already decided, not recklessly, but with a certain economic confidence, kind that came from having thrown the first punch in enough situations to know that the first punch usually ended it. He closed the distance in 2 steps, right hand loading behind his hip, left shoulder dropping as a feint designed to pull the eye down before the real strike came high. It was a good combination. Silas had seen it 3 times in the last 6 weeks, just watching the man train, which meant he'd seen that left shoulder drop enough times that his nervous system had already cataloged it below the level of conscious thought. He didn't block it. Blocking was for people who needed to stop something. Silas stepped left, 1 measured step, and let Brand's right hand pass close enough that he felt the air move against his jaw. And then he was behind Brandon's extended arm, with his right hand on the back of Brandon's elbow, and his left palm flat against the shoulder blade. And he did the simplest thing available to him. He redirected the momentum that was already there, adding nothing to it, just steering it, the way you'd correct a door that was closing too fast. Brandon went into the mat, not catastrophically, not in the way of a man who'd been destroyed. More in the way of a man who'd reached a railing that had shifted 2 inches to the left of where he expected it, a controlled stumble that his own body managed before his brain had finished processing what had happened, which meant he was back on his feet in about 1.5 seconds, which was actually faster than a lot of people would have recovered. The room had not breathed. 21 people, and the only sound was the distant thud of a heavy bag in the back room still swinging on its chain from the last person who'd hit it, the links counting out a slow rhythm like a metronome nobody had asked for. Brandon's expression had not settled yet. It was still in transit between surprise and recalibration, moving through a sequence of small adjustments that his face was trying to make faster than it could manage. He rolled his shoulder, looked at the mat where he'd just been, looked at Silas. "Okay," he said, and his voice had dropped half a register without him deciding to lower it. He came again, and this time there was no preliminary, no feint, loaded shoulder. Just a fast double-leg takedown attempt that was honestly the correct call given what had just happened. Because the man was smart enough to change the problem when the first answer didn't work. That was the thing about genuinely dangerous fighters. They adapted. Not always fast enough, but they adapted. Silas sprawled hips back, weight dropping, both hands on the back of Brandon's head, and it was not pretty. His left knee barked at him from somewhere deep in the joint, a protest that was familiar enough to be information rather than alarm, and he compensated with a grip adjustment that wasn't textbook, but was functional. And he turned Brandon's forward energy into a circle that deposited him back on the mat, face down this time, with Silas's knee on the back of his thigh and his left arm controlling Brandon's right wrist. He held it. Brandon was breathing hard now, not from exhaustion. This had taken maybe 8 seconds total, but from the specific physiological response of a body that had expected to be in control and had discovered it was not, which was its own kind of shock. Silas said quietly, because he felt Brandon's shoulders begin to organize themselves for another attempt. Brandon went still. The word had not been loud. It had not been a threat. It was simply the word don't, delivered in a tone that had learned its particular texture in places where that word meant something with real weight behind it. For 3 seconds, nobody in the room moved. Then Silas released Brandon's wrist, removed his knee, and stood up. His left knee registered the floor again, and that same muted complaint, and he straightened fully and took 1 step back, and that was all. Brandon pushed himself up slowly, got to 1 knee, stayed there for a moment, with his right fist pressed against the mat, breathing. He was not injured. He was processing, and processing was taking a moment, and there was something in that the sight of Brandon Kade on 1 knee in the middle of his own gym that was rearranging the furniture in the room in ways that would take a while to fully map. Nobody said anything. Silas looked at Eli, who had gotten himself up to sitting against the far edge of the mat. There was a mark on Eli's cheekbone, not a cut, but the beginning of a bruise, that first rose-colored skin that would darken by morning. He was watching Silas with an expression that had no good category. "You're done for tonight," Silas told him again. "Get some ice on that." Eli opened his mouth, closed it, nodded. Brandon was on his feet. The look on his face had finished its transit now, and what it had landed on was something Silas had seen before, who had lost something they'd built their entire sense of themselves around. It was not rage, exactly. It was older than rage, quieter, and in some ways more dangerous, because rage had a direction, and this did not. "You want to tell me," Brandon said, "who the hell trained you?" It was not quite a question. Silas considered it anyway. "It doesn't matter," he said. "It matters to me. I know." Silas reached down and picked up the mop that was leaning against the mat's edge. "It shouldn't." Brandon stared at him. His jaw was working slightly, the way jaws worked when the brain was running through options and not loving any of them. Around the room, 21 people were performing various versions of extreme stillness, the deep and genuine stillness of people who were trying to process something that had just contradicted a belief they'd held for a long time. One of the older students, a man named Garrett, who had been at Iron Harbor since the beginning, whose opinion in this room carried weight in the way that only tenure could produce, let out a long, slow breath. It was barely audible, but in the silence of that room, it was everything. Brandon heard it. Something in him reorganized in response to it in a way that made his face briefly ugly. Toward Garrett. He didn't look at Garrett. He looked at Silas. His look was the specific look of a man who had decided that this was not over. This particular moment would not be the one that defined the account, that there were ways to reassert what had just been disrupted. "Round 2, Brandon said. "You and me, let's go." Silas looked at him, then at the clock on the wall, which read 7:43. "You've got a class to finish," Silas said. "I'll finish it when I'm done with you." "You are done with me." He said it the same way you'd say the mop heads are on the 3rd shelf factual. No argument in it. No invitation to debate. That's not a challenge. That's just true. Brandon crossed the mat in 3 steps and got into Silas's space close, the kind of close that was itself a communication, a reminder of size and presence, and everything that proximity to a bigger man was supposed to say. Brandon had 2 inches and 30-something pounds on him, and in Silas's experience, who did that kind of approach were not always going to swing next. Yet they were telling you they were thinking about it. Silas didn't move back. He held his ground with the mop handle loosely in his right hand and looked at Brandon with the same expression he'd had all night, which was approximately the expression of a man waiting for a bus. "What you just started," Brandon said, low. "Exactly what I started," Silas said. "And I know what it's going to finish." A long moment, with about 6 inches of air between them. Brandon stepped back. Not retreat. He would not have characterized it to himself as retreat. and the distinction mattered him, which was itself information. Stepped back and turned to the room, and what he did next was something Silas had to give him grudging respect for, because it was the right tactical move and it took genuine presence of mind to execute it. "That's enough for tonight," Brandon said to the room in his normal voice. "Good session. Everybody stretch out and we'll pick up Monday." He walked toward his office without looking at Silas again. The room exhaled. Slowly, people began moving, the way people moved after something they hadn't expected, with the careful quality of individuals who were not yet certain that the ground was stable. Mats were collected, water bottles retrieved. Whispered conversations started up near the edges of the room, the low urgent energy of people who had witnessed somethings and were already working on how to describe it. Garrett walked past Silas on the way to the locker room and said nothing. "No." But he looked at Silas directly, briefly, with an expression that was not quite acknowledgement and not quite gratitude, and was probably the closest thing to both that a man like Garrett knew how to produce. Silas went back to the storage room and got his jacket and his boots. He sat on the storage room floor to lace them, because there was a step stool in there that was the wrong height, and the floor was fine. His left knee appreciated the absence of the step. He worked the laces with the same methodical attention he brought to lacing them every morning, which was the same attention he brought to everything. Because in his experience, the only way to stop paying attention to detail was to decide that some details didn't matter. No. And he had not yet found a category of details that reliably didn't matter. From behind the thin wall, he could hear the room emptying. Voices, equipment sounds, the specific acoustic signature of a space that was transitioning from event back to building. He heard Mara's voice, short, professional, and then a longer silence, and then the chunk of Brandon's office door. Silas finished the second boot, stood up, put on the jacket. He signed the daily log at the front desk. Mara was looking at her computer screen and did not look up, but her shoulders had a quality to them held too carefully that suggested she had processed the evening and was currently deciding what to do with that processing. "Mara," Silas said. "Mr. Mercer," she said to her screen. He went out the side door into the August dark. The parking lot was half empty now, people having filtered out fast the way people did after charged situations. The air outside was still warm and close and smelled like asphalt, and the distant suggestion of rain that had been threatening all day without committing. The broken street lamp at the far end of the lot, the one that had been flickering for 3 weeks on the work order that nobody had gotten to, was doing its intermittent thing, on, off, on, throwing brief washes of orange light across the cracked blacktop. Silas walked to his truck. It was a 9 F-150 in a shade of green that had faded to something between sage and gray, with a front bumper that had been in contact with a concrete median 6 years ago and had healed imperfectly, a nose that had been broken and reset by someone who wasn't a doctor. Yes, he'd bought it for 14 Bint in Youngstown, who needed to leave downtown faster than the resale market timeline allowed, which was its own story that Silas had not asked about. He got in, sat for a moment without starting the engine. His right hand was resting on the steering wheel, and he looked at it, not for any particular reason, just the way you looked at your hands sometimes when you'd used them in a way that reminded you of other times you'd used them. There was a small abrasion on the palm where he'd caught the mat during the sprawl. Not even worth a bandage, but it was there. Started the truck. The engine turned over with the specific sound of an engine that was functional, but no longer enthusiastic, a reliable resignation that Silas found more honest than a lot of things. He backed out of the space and headed for Route 9. He drove for about 4 minutes before he registered that he'd driven past his turn. He sat at the next light and recognized this for what it was, which was his brain working through something that his body already knew needed working through, using the act of driving as cover. He made a U-turn at the intersection, legal, technically, though the sign was a little ambiguous, and headed back toward the strip mall. He didn't go inside. Parked across the street, in the tax preparer's lot, with a clear sight line to Iron Harbor's front door and the side service entrance, and he sat with the engine off and watched. This was not something he would have been able to explain adequately to anyone, which was fine because he was not in the habit of explaining himself. It was the same impulse that had made him, for the first 2 years after he'd left his previous life, drive past the houses of people he'd casually registered as problems before going home, not surveillance. Anything formal. Just the specific inability to fully disengage from a situation that had not resolved itself to the baseline he considered acceptable. Brandon's truck, a newer Silverado black, the kind of truck that communicated something about its owner in the specific dialect of rural Ohio masculinity, was still in the lot. Office light was on behind the window. At 8:17, 2 of the regular advanced students came out of the side door, together, talking, and walked to their cars. 29. Garrett came out alone, stood in the parking lot for a moment, looking at nothing, and then got in his car and left. At 8:41, Mara came out carrying her bag and her jacket and walked to a small Civic at the near end of the lot. She stopped halfway to her car, looked across the street at Silas's truck. Silas was fairly sure she couldn't see him clearly at this distance and angle, with no interior light on. Mara was the kind of woman who noticed the specific shape of stillness that didn't belong, and she stood looking for a moment before she got in her car and drove away, without apparently having made a decision about what she'd noticed. At 9:03, Brandon's office light went off. Silas waited. At 9:11, Brandon came out of the front door, locked it behind him, and stood in the parking lot. He had his phone out, and he was looking at it. And even from across the street and in the bad lighting, Silas could see the set of his shoulders, which was different from any set he'd seen on Brandon in the 6 weeks he'd observed him in the building. Brandon Kade, for the first time in Silas's experience of him, looked like he didn't know what to do next. He stood in the parking lot for about 40 seconds. Then he got in his truck and drove away. Silas sat for another minute after the taillights disappeared. Then he started the F-150 and drove home. He made a sandwich, drank a glass of water, did his joint mobility work on the floor, slower than usual because his left knee was telling him more than it usually told him, and he listened to it carefully the way you listened to any reliable source of information about conditions ahead. He thought about what happened next. The realistic sequence was Brandon processed tonight, found a frame for it that let him continue functioning. And then at some point in the next week, maybe Monday, maybe sooner, he did something about it. What that something was depended on which Brandon was available. The Brandon who was a legitimate fighter with genuine skill and a bad personal history and real things to be afraid of. Or the Brandon who had been running a small empire of intimidation, long enough to believe that the empire was permanent. In Silas's experience, those two Brandons were not easy to predict, and the unpredictable versions of people were the ones that required more attention. He went to bed at 10:15. He lay in the dark and thought about Eli's face when he'd seen Silas step onto the mat, not just the surprise, but something under it. No, something that had needed to see that, and hadn't known it needed to see it until the moment it was there. Silas had been looked at that way before, in hallways of buildings in places he didn't name, by men and women who had been running on an empty long enough to have forgotten that backup was a real thing. He didn't love being looked at that way. It was a weight, being someone's evidence that a thing was possible. He understood why he'd stepped onto the mat. He understood it the way he understood his own left knee, not as a choice exactly, but as a structure he'd built over years that had its own logic, and when the conditions met the logic, the action followed. Arguing with it after the fact was about as productive as arguing with weather. He slept and did not dream. In the morning he woke at 4:15, made coffee, dressed for work. At 4:47, he guided the mop bucket through the service entrance of Iron Harbor Combat Club the same way he always did. The left wheel, pulling slightly, his hand correcting without thought. The mats were the same. The expensive logo was the same. The 4 camera angles were the same. Everything was the same. Except that on mat 3, Somebody had left a sparring glove overnight, a right hand, medium weight, the kind with the Velcro wrist wrap that was always one wash cycle away from failing, sitting upright in the center of the mat, thumb facing up, is like a thing that had been placed there deliberately. Silas looked at it for a moment. Then he got the mop and started at the back, the way he always started. He didn't touch the glove. He worked around it. By 6:08, when Cole came in through the front door in his faded Michigan State shirt and nodded at the equipment and didn't notice Silas, the mat was clean and the glove was still there, sitting in the center of the logo under the hum of the fluorescent lights. 6:27, Eli Dawson came through the front door. He was not scheduled for the morning. He saw Silas. He saw the glove on the mat. He put down his bag near the wall and stood at the edge of the mat for a moment, looking at the glove, then at Silas. "That yours?" Eli asked. "No, is it a message or something?" "It's a glove someone forgot." Eli looked at the glove for another moment. The bruise on his cheekbone had developed overnight into a proper bruise, the kind that would make people ask questions for the next week. He was moving carefully, not because he was hurt, but because everything was sore in the way that soreness after adrenaline was different from regular soreness, and his body was reminding him of every moment of the previous night with specific and unhurried detail. "I came to say something," Eli said. Silas kept mopping. "Okay, what you did last night," Eli stopped, started differently. "I don't know what I'm supposed to do with that." "You don't have to do anything with it." "That's easy to say. It's also true." Eli sat down on the bench near the wall. Not the mat, the bench, which was the boundary of the space, neither inside it nor out. The specific location of someone who hadn't decided yet. He's not going to let it go. You know that, right? He's going to come after you. Maybe not the same way, but he'll find a way to... Silas stopped mopping, looked at him. "I know." A silence. "Were you in the military?" Eli asked. Silas looked at him for a long moment. Calculating a lie he didn't lie as a policy, because lies had maintenance costs, but deciding what part of a complicated answer was actually useful here. For a while, he said, "How long is a while?" "Long enough." Eli nodded at this, accepting it with the specific acceptance of someone who understood that the question had been answered, even if the answer was smaller than the question. He rubbed the bruise on his cheekbone, gently, the way you touched something to remind yourself of it. "I'm not going to stop training," he said, not to Silas. Exactly. More like a thing he was saying out loud to make it real. "But I might need to find somewhere else to train." "Probably," Silas said. Eli looked at him. "That doesn't bother you? What happens to this place after last night?" Silas picked up the mop again. "That's not my problem to solve." "It kind of is. You started it." Silas thought about that. It wasn't wrong exactly. It also wasn't the frame he was going to accept. "I finished something that started a long time before last night," he said. "That's different." He went back to mopping. Eli sat on the bench for a while longer, watching him work, and neither of them said anything else, and the fluorescent lights hummed their same monotonous frequency above the expensive mats. And somewhere in the back of the building, the AC unit kicked on with a shudder, and the air shifted fractionally cooler against the concrete. 6:58, the front door opened. Not Cole. A regular. A man Silas had not seen before, mid-40s, built like someone who had trained seriously once and maintained it casually since, in dark jeans and a gray pullover. He stood in the entrance with the specific quality of a man who had come to see the room, not use it, his eyes moving across the space in a pattern that Silas recognized as professional. The man's eyes found Silas. Silas kept mopping. The man walked toward him, unhurried, hands easy at his sides. "You, Mercer?" he said. Silas didn't answer right away. He finished the stroke he was on, wrung out the mop, started the next one. "Depends on who's asking," he said. The man reached into his pocket and produced a business card which he set on the edge of the weight bench nearest to Silas. White card, clean design, minimal text. Silas could read it from where he stood without picking it up, which he did not do. The name on the card meant nothing to him. The organization name below it meant quite a lot. Silas stopped mopping. He looked at the man. Something was moving through the architecture of the morning in a way that he hadn't calculated for. And that specific sensation, the sensation of a situation exceeding its anticipated edges, was one he had learned to treat with a great deal of respect. "How'd you find this place?" Silas asked. The man's expression didn't change. "We've known where you were for about 14 months, he said. "We just weren't sure it was time yet." Eli, on the bench by the wall, had gone very still. Silas looked at the card once more. The fluorescent light above mat 3 chose this moment to flicker, not die. Just flicker, once, the way it had been doing for weeks, and, in that half-second of interrupted light, looked like something else entirely. "Tell me," Silas said quietly, "what changed?" The man's name, according to the card, was David Reese. He didn't offer a hand to shake. He didn't sit down. Stood in the middle of the gym floor, with the card still on the bench between them, and looked particular patience of someone's with the particular patient who had conducted enough of these conversations to know that rushing them produced worse outcomes than waiting. Silas looked at the organization name on the card again. 4 letters, the kind of abbreviation that didn't appear on any public-facing directory, that wouldn't return useful results in a standard search, that existed in the specific category of names, that people who knew what they meant recognized immediately, and people who didn't know what they meant had no frame for. Silas knew what it meant. He set down the mop handle carefully, the way you set down something that you want to be able to pick back up. "Outside," he said. Reese nodded once and walked back toward the front entrance, without checking whether Silas was following, which told Silas something about either the man's confidence or his read of the situation, and both options were worth noting. Silas looked at Eli, who was sitting on the bench with the careful stillness of someone trying very hard to communicate that he was not listening. "Finish your stretch," Silas said. "Then go home." Eli opened his mouth. "Go home, Eli." He went out the side door, instead of the front, came around the building's exterior, and found Reese standing at the far end of the parking lot near the flickering street lamp, which had committed to off in the morning light and was now just a dead orange bulb above a cracked concrete base. The August air was already thick at 7 in the morning. The kind of heat that didn't build it was simply there, the way it had been there, all night, waiting. Reese was looking at his phone when Silas came around the corner, and he put it away without rushing, which was either good manners or a performance of good manners, and Silas didn't yet have enough information to know which. 14 months, Silas said, give or take, and nobody came by until today. That's right. What changed? Reese looked at him levelly. He had a broad, unremarkable face, the kind of face that was genuinely difficult to describe afterward, which Silas recognized as either a natural gift or a cultivated discipline, which probably didn't matter either way. His eyes were the specific gray of overcast sky, not particularly warm, not cold either. Functional eyes. Assessment tools. Harlan Voss, Reese said. The name landed the way names like that landed, when you hadn't heard them in a long time, not with shock, because shock required surprise, and Silas's response to that name was something older and more structural than surprise. It was the sensation of a weight that he'd set down carefully in a specific location, discovering after years of staying put that someone had moved it. Voss is in Leavenworth, Silas said. Voss was in Leavenworth, Reese said. His lawyer filed a procedural appeal 14 weeks ago. Kind that usually goes nowhere. A pause. This one went somewhere. Silas looked at the dead street lamp for a moment. The concrete base had a crack running from the ground up to about knee height, and something green was growing in the crack. Not a weed exactly, more the idea of a plant. Thin and persistent, in the way of things that grew in places with poor conditions and no encouragement. What does that mean exactly? Went somewhere. It means he has a hearing date. 52 days from Thursday. Reese's voice was the same temperature it had been for the entire conversation, which was the temperature of someone delivering a briefing rather than having a conversation. It also means that 3 of the 7 witnesses from the original proceeding are currently unavailable. The word unavailable did enough work on its own that Silas didn't need to ask it to do more. 3, he said, 3, and the other 4. Being located, Reese looked at him. Some of them are easier to locate than others. The morning was doing what August mornings in Ohio did, which was get heavier rather than lighter as the sun came up, the humidity thickening rather than burning off, the air pressing down with a specific physical weight that required you to move through it rather than in it. Silas was aware of this the way he was aware of his left knee as a background condition requiring acknowledgement without complaint. "You came here to tell me I'm on a list," Silas said. "Came here to tell you the situation has changed and to offer you resources." "What kind of resources?" "Relocation, new documentation if needed, protection detail for the duration of the hearing process." Reese reached into the inside pocket of his pullover and produced a phone, one of those, the kind with a specific case design that Silas recognized from contexts he hadn't operated in for 7 years. Direct line, 24 hours. Silas looked at the phone. Did not take it. Harlan Voss, he said carefully, had 3 separate opportunities to resolve his situation without involving me. He chose differently each time. Whatever his lawyer is doing with procedural filings doesn't change the underlying facts of what he did. Reese agreed. It doesn't. So what you're actually here to tell me is that the underlying facts may not be enough. Reese said nothing, which was its own answer. Silas breathed in the thick morning air. "Let it out. How many people know I'm here? On our side?" 4, including me. "On his side? That's the part we don't have full visibility on." Reese set the phone on top of the concrete base of the street lamp, between them. "Which is why I'm standing in a strip mall parking lot at 7 in the morning." Silas looked at the phone for a long moment. Then he picked it up. Because he decided anything more, because leaving it sitting on a cracked concrete base in a parking lot in Greyhaven, Ohio seemed like a poor decision regardless of what he decided about everything else. He put it in his jacket pocket. "Give me 48 hours, he said. Reese nodded. He took the business card back from his pocket. Silas hadn't returned it, and Silas realized he was still holding it. He handed it over, and Reese pocketed it. "Don't go anywhere unfamiliar," Reese said. "Routines are fine. New places aren't. I know the protocol." "You know it." A pause. "That's not why I'm saying it." He walked to his car, a rental, silver, mid-size, the category of vehicle specifically chosen for its anonymity, and got in without looking back. Silas watched it pull out of the lot and turn north on Route 9 and disappear into the ordinary traffic of a Thursday morning in a town nobody had specifically chosen. Stood in the parking lot for a moment. Then he went back inside and picked up the mop. He had 2 hours left on his shift. He worked them. The name Harlan Voss was not something Silas permitted himself to think about in any extended way during working hours, which was a discipline he'd developed not as a coping strategy, but as a functional necessity, because in his experience, the things that required the most careful thinking were precisely the things that went wrong when you thought about them at the wrong time, in the wrong state, with insufficient information in front of you. So he mopped the wait area and cleaned the bathrooms and restocked the paper towels in the supply cabinet and signed the daily log at the front desk. And he did all of it with the same systematic attention he always brought to it. And he let the other things sit in a separate room of his mind, with the door closed, the way you might let a kettle boil in the kitchen while you finish something in the other room. He thought about it on the bus home. Harlan Voss was 61 years old, or would be by now. Spent 26 years in a career that had officially not existed, in the specific way that some careers didn't exist, and had been decorated for it in ceremonies that also didn't exist, and had built around himself over those 26 years a particular kind of organization, not large, not flashy, kind that intervened, not the kind that attracted attention in the ways that attracted congressional oversight, that had operated in the spaces between officially acknowledged operations with the specific efficiency of something that had been designed to be invisible. Silas had trained people for that organization, not for Voss directly, not in the beginning. For the adjacent structures, the ones that fed into the larger system, the pipeline that went from raw candidates to functional operatives, through a process that Silas had been part of for 11 years. He had also, at the end of those 11 years, provided testimony that had sent Harlan Voss to Leavenworth. That testimony had cost him things he still sometimes did the accounting on at 3 in the morning when 3 and sleep was unavailable. Career, obviously, but that had been functionally over, regardless, given what he'd witnessed and what he'd refused to do about it for 2 years before finally deciding that the refusal itself was a form of participation. His left knee, which had preceded Leavenworth by about 18 months, but whose full damage had been sustained in a parking structure in a city he didn't name, on a night that had been a direct consequence of him starting to talk to the right people. A version of himself that had believed in the structure of the thing, in the institution, in the idea that there was a correct chain of events that followed when you reported what you'd seen. That version of himself had not survived the process entirely intact. What had survived was functional, serviceable, good at cleaning floors without making too much noise. He got off the 2 stops early and walked the rest of the way because his knee wanted movement more than it wanted rest, and because walking gave the thought somewhere to go. Harlan Voss, with a hearing date, 62 days from Thursday. 3 witnesses unavailable. Unavailable was a clean word for an ugly fact. Silas walked through the residential blocks between the bus stop and his apartment building, 4-unit building, 2nd floor. Vience, the kind of structure that had been built in the 70s and maintained with the kind of intermittent attention that kept it standing without improving it, and looked at the ordinary machinery of a Thursday morning in a mid-size Ohio town. Kids on bikes, a woman walking a dog with a specific arthritis in its back legs that she'd clearly accommodated her pace to for long enough that it was simply the pace now. A man on a porch with coffee, doing anything else, just being on a porch with coffee, which struck Silas as one of the more genuinely reasonable things a person could do with a morning. He thought about relocation. New documentation, Reese had said. New city, new name, new supply closet in a new building, where nobody knew anything about him that he hadn't chosen to tell them. He had done this before, not for this reason, but the mechanics were familiar, and the part of him that ran logistics acknowledged it as a viable option with minimal friction. He thought about Eli's face when he'd said, "I'm not going to stop training." He put his key in the apartment door and went inside and sat at the kitchen table and did not make coffee. He sat at the table for 23 minutes, which he knew because the clock on the microwave was directly in his line of sight. Then he reached for the phone in his jacket pocket, not the one Reese had given him, his own, and looked at the contact he'd saved 6 weeks ago and never used. Cal Rourke. He had Cal's number because Cal had been his own trainer briefly, 31 years ago, in a different version of Ohio that felt more distant than time could account for. Cal was 70-something now, still ran a boxing gym out of a basement space in the Millard Street building downtown, had been running it for 40 years, and had the specific brand of stubbornness that aged men in his profession either developed or lost early because the ones who lost it stopped running basement gyms. Silas had kept the number not for himself. He'd thought about calling it maybe 4 times since he'd moved to Greyhaven, always for reasons adjacent to Eli. Always deciding against it because it wasn't his place to redirect someone else's training path when that someone else hadn't asked him to. He looked at the number. Then he put the phone on the table and left it there. Was not going to solve the Eli problem today. Yeah. The Eli problem was a secondary problem that would need to wait for the primary problem to develop enough shape that he knew what he was dealing with. He made coffee, after all, because the alternative was sitting at a table doing nothing, and sitting at a table doing nothing was a state he'd learned to be suspicious of in himself. Primary problem developed shape faster than he'd expected. It happened the next morning. He was on his shift, 6:15, working the mat area before the morning class, when the front door opened in the specific way of someone who had checked whether anyone was watching before they opened it, which was a quality of entry that Silas registered without appearing to register it. 2 men came in, not members. The membership here had a look that came from the specific combination of regular exposure to the facility and the casual ownership of space that members developed. These men had neither. They were in their 30s, one taller than the other. Yes, he'd intervened, both carrying themselves with the deliberate casualness of people who were trying not to look deliberate, which was a more common failure of tradecraft than most people appreciated. The taller one looked around the room. His eyes found Silas near the mat and stayed there about 2 seconds longer than they should have. "Gym open," he said. "Morning class starts at 6:30, Silas said. He kept mopping. "We're thinking about joining. Reception opens at 6. Mara can help you." The shorter one had moved slightly to the left, which put him at an angle to Silas that was either a natural drift or a positioning choice, and Silas filed the ambiguity without resolving it. He kept the mop moving, long, even strokes. His hands on the handle were relaxed in the specific way of hands that looked relaxed because they'd been trained to look that way. Actually, the taller one said, still looking at Silas, "We're not really here about the gym. "'Kay, we heard about some trouble here the other night." Silas wrung out the mop. The bucket's left wheel wobbled in its familiar way. "Places like this have sparring sessions. Somebody always thinks it was trouble." "This was a specific kind of trouble," the taller one said. He took steps up toward the mat, not threatening at exactly, but closing distance in the way of people who'd learned that proximity changed conversations. "Involving a maintenance worker." Silas looked at him for the first time since they'd come in. Unhurried, "You should wait for Mara. We're not here for Mara." A silence. Silas looked at the shorter one, who had drifted another foot to the left and was now in a position that would have been tactically useful if this were a different kind of situation, and less tactically obvious if he'd been better trained. The shorter one met his eyes and looked away first, which told Silas quite a bit. "I'm going to ask you to wait by the front desk," Silas said. Loudly, not with anything in his voice beyond the statement itself. "Or leave. Those are the two options." The taller one looked at him for a moment with an expression that was trying to project something and landing on uncertainty instead, which was itself information. "Harlan says hello," he said. The mop stopped. The taller one seemed to take some satisfaction from this, which was a mistake that people who did not understand the difference between making someone stop and making someone pause frequently made. Silas set the mop handle against the mat's edge. He straightened fully. He looked at the taller man with no change in his expression whatsoever, which was the expression of someone who had received information that required processing rather than responding to, and was doing the processing. "Harlan," Silas said, "knows where I work. Harlan knows a lot of things. Harlan knows this conversation isn't necessary." He picked the mop back up. "Go tell him whatever you came here to find out, which is that I'm here, I'm aware of the situation, and I haven't moved." Taller one looked at him for 3 more seconds. Then he looked at the shorter one, and some communication passed between them that didn't require words, and they walked back to the front door. The door the taller one stopped, didn't turn around. "He said to tell you that the people who talked before might want to reconsider what they're planning to say again." Silas said nothing. The door closed. Stood in the middle of the mat area with the mop in his hands, and the fluorescent light above him doing its intermittent flicker, and the gym completely empty around him, and he breathed in through his nose and out through his mouth twice. It was not a calming technique, but an assessment technique, clearing the physiological static to hear what the actual soul signal was underneath. The signal was clear enough. Voss wasn't waiting for the hearing. He was running a parallel track procedural appeal in front, pressure campaign in back. 3 witnesses unavailable. Now someone standing in this gym floor telling him that the people who'd talked might want to reconsider what they planned to say again. Which meant Silas was now inside the hearing's orbit, whether he wanted to be or not. Pulled the phone Reese had given him out of his pocket and looked at it. Single contact saved in it. No name, just a number. He pressed call. It rang once. "They found you faster than I expected," Reese said. "Here at the gym, 6:22. Message delivered on behalf of Voss." Taller one did the talking. Shorter one tried to establish a secondary angle. Bad positioning. He paused. "Amateur work. He's not using anyone with real training. He's using what he has left. Most of the people who owed him significant favors were trying to distance themselves from the appeal. A sound in the background, on Reese, and something that might have been a door or might have been a coffee maker. Does this change your timeline? It moves it up, Silas said. I need to make some arrangements here before I can be useful to you. Pause. What kind of arrangements? Personal. How long? He thought about it. Thought about Eli. Thought about the address in his phone he'd never called. Thought about the specific shape of what he owed and to whom and whether that calculus had changed. 24 hours, he said. You have 12, Reese said. After 12 hours from right now, I'm sending a car. Silas looked at the clock on the wall. 6:27. 12 hours. 12 hours, Mercer. He ended the call. Put the phone back in his pocket. Picked up the mop and finished the mat area, because the mat area still needed finishing, and the morning class started in 3 minutes, and whatever else was true, he was not the kind of man who left a job half done. 6:30, the morning class came in. Eli was with them. Silas looked at him for a moment. Eli had his gear bag, his bruised cheekbone, this specific expression of someone who had decided something overnight and was carrying the decision, the way you carried something heavy, not complaining about it, but not pretending it was light either. After the class filed in and Silas collected his cart, he walked past Eli and said, without stopping, 5 minutes with you at the end of your session. Eli nodded. The 5 minutes happened at 8:04, in the parking lot, with the morning heat already building against the blacktop and the sound of Route 9 traffic as consistent background. Silas handed Eli a piece of paper. He'd written the address before his shift this morning, Cal Rourke's gym, from the contact in his phone. With the days and hours, Cal typically ran beginner and intermediate sessions, Thursday evenings, Saturday mornings, occasional Tuesday afternoons, and Cal's phone number at the bottom. Eli looked at it. What is this? A coach. An actual one. His name is Cal Rourke. He runs Foundry Boxing Hall on Millard Street. He's old, he's difficult, and he doesn't have cameras in his gym. Eli looked up from the paper. He stopped. Started again. Are you leaving? Silas didn't answer that directly. Call that number today. Tell him Silas Mercer gave you the address. He'll remember the name. Why would he? He'll remember it. Eli looked at the paper for a moment. At the address, the number, back at Silas, with the expression of someone trying to read a situation that had more layers than they'd been given tools to navigate. What's happening? This morning, those two guys who came in and left without talking to anyone. Nothing that involves you. It feels like it involves me. It doesn't. He meant it, and he said it with enough weight that Eli heard the difference between reassurance and fact. What involves you is on that piece of paper. Call him today. Eli folded the paper carefully, put it in his pocket. He looked at Silas with that expression again, the one that Silas found difficult, not because it was complicated, but because it was simple. It was the expression of someone who hadn't a lot to give them something useful and weren't sure yet whether this was real. Are you going to be okay? Eli asked. The question landed quietly. Silas looked at him. He's 19 years old, bruised cheekbone, a folded piece of paper in his pocket, and a road in front of him that was going to be difficult in ways that weren't Iron Harbor's particular brand of difficult, that were slower and more unglamorous and would require him to rebuild everything he thought he knew about how to fight from a foundation he didn't have yet. It was not going to be easy. It was going to be exactly the kind of thing that people who cared about looking capable avoided until it was too late to build it properly. He was going to call the number. Silas could see that. Some things you could tell from how a person folded a piece of paper. No. Call the number, Silas said. He walked to his truck. He drove home, changed out of his work clothes, sat at the kitchen table and took out the phone Reese had given him, and the address Reese had used on the business card, not his own address. It was a relay address. But there was a secondary contact number printed small under the organizational abbreviation that was a direct dispatch line. No. That number. He thought about what 12 hours actually meant in operational terms, and what the realistic sets of scenarios were, and which of those scenarios he could walk into with the best chance of being useful rather than simply present. He made coffee, real coffee, not from the machine but from the stovetop pot that his sister had sent him 4 years ago for a birthday he hadn't mentioned was happening. Kind she'd sent, because she'd said he was too stubborn to own anything that required maintenance, and the stovetop pot required maintenance, and she had been right and wrong simultaneously in the way sisters typically were. He thought about Harlan Voss, and what Voss had understood at the end, about what Silas had done and why. Voss had understood it perfectly. That was the part that people who studied those proceedings from the outside missed. They assumed personal betrayal, institutional failure, some spectacular rupture. The reality was more mundane and more terrible. Voss had understood Silas's reasoning. He'd simply believed with the specific confidence of a man who had operated outside accountability for long enough that it had changed his perception of what was possible, that the reasoning would not be enough, that the institution would fold, that the procedural weight would collapse inward, the way it always collapsed inward around people like Voss, who had spent careers learning exactly which load-bearing walls to remove. He had been almost right. Almost. Silas poured the coffee, drank it standing at the kitchen counter, looking at the window that faced the parking lot of his apartment building, where nothing in particular was happening. 2 cars, a dumpster, the far edge of a maple tree that was still technically green in August, but was already preparing to give that up. Thought about the shorter man's positioning this morning, the way his eyes had moved before they'd met Silas's, and looked away. The specific quality of that look. He'd seen that quality in training environments, in people who were being asked to do things they hadn't signed up for and were doing them because the person asking had something over them. Loyalty. Obligation. There was a difference, and it mattered. He finished the coffee, set the cup in the sink, reached for the dispatch number. Yes, he'd intervened, and then stopped, because something was happening in the parking lot that required his full attention. No. The silver rental car from that morning was at the far edge of the lot, in the shadow of the maple tree, and David Reese was not in it. The man sitting in the driver's seat, barely visible in the tree shadow with the engine off and the windows up in the August heat, was not David Reese. Silas put the phone down on the counter very carefully. He went to the window at a specific angle, not standing in front of it, but the side, the part of the frame that gave him sightline, without giving anything in the apartment a clear silhouette to resolve, and looked at the car. The man in the car was looking at the building's main entrance. Silas's window, at the entrance. Silas picked up both phones, his own and Reese's, and moved away from the kitchen, through the short hallway, yes, into the bedroom, where the window faced the opposite direction, the street side. He stood next to that window and called Reese's number. 2 rings. "There's a silver rental in my building's parking lot," Silas said when Reese picked up. "Driver I don't recognize. Same model as your car this morning." "That's not my car," Reese said, and his voice had shifted off the briefing temperature into something more alert. "It's not your car." A pause that lasted about 3 seconds, which was long enough to tell Silas this Reese was recalculating something. "Mercer," Reese said, "don't use the main entrance." "Already ahead of you." "How far ahead?" Silas was already in the hallway closet, pulling on his jacket, the one with the inside pocket that he'd been using for the phones. "Far enough. Where do you need me?" "I'm sending a location to this number." "How soon can you move?" He thought about the building's back exit, the service alley, the bus routes from Millard Street, the 7-minute walk he'd clocked without meaning to in his second week in Greyhaven between his apartment and the next nearest point of transportation. He thought about his left knee and what it would accept as a pace over that distance. 5 minutes, he said. "Make it 4, Reese said, and ended the call. Silas put on his jacket. He paused at the kitchen doorway, not to get anything. Just a pause. The half-second kind that happened sometimes at the edge of transitions. The moment before the before became the after. Coffee cup was in the sink. The stovetop pot was on the burner. The window light was coming in at its Thursday morning angle across the kitchen table, where he'd sat 23 minutes at the beginning of all of this, doing nothing. And the table looked like what it was, a table in a small apartment in a mid-size Ohio town, where a man had been attempting, with reasonable success, to be no one in particular. He looked at it for half a second. Then he went out the back. The service alley was between his building and the dry cleaner next door, narrow enough that the dumpsters on both sides left about 4 feet of clear walking. It smelled like all service alleys smelled in August, which was not a smell worth describing. He moved through it at a pace his knee accepted without argument, came out on the street behind the building, turned left, and walked. Ordinary Thursday morning walk, nothing in his hands. Jacket in the heat that was beginning to draw a comment from every exposed surface of his skin, but which served a purpose. His left knee tracking information about the ground beneath him, with each step stable, dry, navigable. Behind him, in the parking lot he was no longer in, a silver car sat in the shadow of a maple tree with a man in it who was watching a door that Silas had not walked out of. Ahead, in 62 days from Thursday, a hearing room where a man named Harlan Voss intended to walk out of a set of consequences that a different version of Silas Mercer, an older and more institutional version, had spent everything he had to make permanent. He walked. The location Reese sent came through on the special phone 2 minutes later, an address on the other side of Greyhaven, the commercial district near the old mill, kind of area with enough parking and enough foot traffic and enough anonymous buildings to be useful. 11 minutes by his estimate. His knee offered no objections he wasn't already managing. He walked and thought about Eli Dawson, calling a number on a piece of paper. Yes, he'd intervened. And an old man in a basement gym on Millard Street picking up the phone and hearing a name he hadn't heard in more than 30 years, and what that would sound like on both ends. Yes, he'd intervened. He thought about it, the way you thought about the one thing you'd done right in a week that had been complicated. Then he stopped thinking about it. He had 11 minutes and a job in front of him that required everything else. He walked, and the August morning pressed down from above like a hand, and Greyhaven moved around him, oblivious. Ordinary, it's continuous, and Silas Mercer moved through it, the way he'd always moved through everything, which was without asking it to notice him. Was fine. He had never needed it to. The address Reese had sent resolved to a building on Carver Street, 2 blocks east of the old Greyhaven Mill complex, part of town that had been trying to reinvent itself as light commercial for about 15 years without fully committing to the project. The building was 3 stories, brick, with a ground floor unit that had most recently been a print shop, and before that, a bookkeeper's office, and before that, judging by the ghost of lettering still visible on the transom window, something called Hartwell and Sons that had not survived long enough for anyone to care what it had sold. The door was unlocked. Silas went in. The ground floor smelled like toner and old paper, and beneath that the specific dry smell of brick buildings that had been standing long enough to develop their own atmospheric identity. It was dim. The front windows had paper over them. Not professionally installed, just taped craft paper of the kind you use to protect floors during painting. A folding table near the back wall, 2 chairs. A third chair that had been pushed against the wall, as though someone had started to add it to the setup, and then reconsidered. Reese was there, and beside him, standing rather than sitting, was a woman Silas had not seen before. She was in her mid-50s, which he registered as a baseline, and then immediately set aside as irrelevant. She was wearing the kind of clothes that were designed to be invisible dark slacks, a gray jacket, the wardrobe of someone who had long since stopped spending mental energy on how they looked and spent it, instead on where they were looking, which was currently at Silas, with the specific attention of someone conducting an announcement they'd been preparing for. Reese said, I know who she is, Silas said. The woman's expression didn't change. Notes. Her name was Margaret Cho, and she had been the senior oversight coordinator for the proceeding that had put Harlan Voss in Leavenworth, and the last time Silas had seen her face she had been across a conference table from him in a building in D. C telling him that his testimony had been received and that he should expect to be contacted regarding nexts, which had been 7 years ago and had not been followed by contact until this week. "Sit down, Mercer," she said. "I've been walking," he said. "I'll stand." She looked at him for a moment. Then she pulled one of the chairs from the table and sat in it herself, and Reese sat in the other one, and Silas remained standing near the door, which was where he'd stopped, which put the table between him and both of them, and the door, at his back, which was simply where his feet had taken him, and which he didn't bother to reposition. "The man in the parking lot," Silas said. "Not ours," Reese said. "He's not yours. Who is he?" Cho folded her hands on the table. She had a tablet in front of her that she hadn't opened yet. "His name is Ferraro. He was Voss's logistics coordinator for the last 4 years of Voss's operational period. He was not indicted in the original proceeding because the evidence connecting him to the core activities was insufficient," Silas said. Circumstantial," Cho said, with the particular precision of someone who had spent a career distinguishing between those two things. "He's been operating independently since Voss's incarceration, doing various kinds of contract work." "What kind of contract work?" "Kind that currently has him sitting in a parking lot watching your building," Reese said. Silas looked at the papered-over window. The August light came through the craft paper in a diffuse amber that made the room look like it was developing itself. It's like a photograph in the old chemical process, shapes emerging slowly from a liquid baseline. "The 3 witnesses," Silas said. "Ferraro?" "We believe so," Cho said. "We can't confirm the connection to all 3, but 2 of them we can place him within a reasonable." "What happened to them?" A pause. "One relocated voluntarily before we could establish protective contact," Cho said, with the careful phrasing of someone describing a mistake they'd been part of. "One had a car accident. Non-fatal significant injuries." She stopped. "One we haven't been able to locate." "When you say unavailable, one of those 3 meanings?" "Yes." Silas breathed in. Out. The room smelled like paper and the past, and he was aware of his left knee in the specific way he became aware of it when he'd been standing for a while, without enough movement to keep the joint from registering its history. "What do you need from me?" he said. Cho opened the tablet. "Sit down, Mercer. This is going to take a while." "I've been walking," he said again. It came out flatter this time, less information and more statement. She looked at him over the tablet and apparently decided that this particular battle was not worth its cost, because she looked back down at the screen. "The appeal is procedural in structure but substantive in intent," she said. "Voss's legal team is arguing that the testimony provided in the original proceeding was obtained under conditions that compromised its integrity. Specifically, they're alleging that witnesses were provided with pre-briefed narratives rather than independently recalling events. That's not what happened. We know that. So tell me why you need me in a room with craft paper on the windows." Reese shifted in his chair. "Because the problem isn't what happened. Problem is that 2 of the remaining 4 witnesses are uncertain whether they want to go through it again. About whether the protection this time is going to be more reliable than the protection last time." The last 3 words sat in the room's particular silence for a moment. Silas looked at Reese. "Is it?" Reese met his eyes. "We made structural changes after—" "Is it?" Silas said again. Pause that lasted about 4 seconds, which was long enough to answer the question without answering it. "We have more resources allocated this time," Cho said. "The oversight structure is different. There are additional layers of—" "Margaret." He used her first name deliberately because he'd spent 7 years not using it, and the use of it now was itself a communication. She looked up. "The last time I had 3 people tell me there were adequate resources allocated and that the oversight structure was sound. One of those people was you. And I spent 11 months in a procedural holding pattern while Voss's people applied enough pressure to a witness whose name I was never officially given that witness recanted testimony that I personally knew was accurate. 'Cause I had been standing in the same room when the events described occurred." The room was quiet. And then Silas continued, his voice still the same level it had been for the entire conversation, While the procedural holding pattern was ongoing, I had a conversation with a man in a parking structure who explained to me that the holding pattern was going to be permanent unless I was willing to expand the scope of what I was willing to testify to. And when I declined to expand that scope, because expanding it would have required me to characterize events in ways that were not accurate, that conversation ended in a way that took 8 months of physical therapy to fully process. He said anything so. He looked at both of them. Is the protection adequate this time? Cho closed the tablet. She looked at her hands on the table for a moment, not ashamed, exactly, but processing something at a speed that her face couldn't entirely conceal. She said, "Not the way you mean it. We don't have the resources to guarantee what happened before won't happen again. What we have is a shorter timeline, a narrower exposure window, and a proceeding that's attracted enough institutional attention that making witnesses disappear carries significantly higher risk than it did seven years ago." "That's honest," Silas said. "I'm trying to be. That's also not enough." "I know." Finally, from the door, not to the table, but sideways, lean against the brick wall to the left of the entrance. Because his knee wanted to do something other than lock under his full weight, and the wall was the available compromise. He looked at the ceiling, which was pressed tin, kind, with a repeating pattern of small squares that had been painted over so many times that the edges of the pattern had softened into suggestions. "Tell me about the 4 remaining witnesses," he said. Reese pulled out a folder actual paper, which Silas noted as a deliberate choice, because everything that mattered in rooms like this was either on paper or in memory, in devices, and opened it on the table. He didn't hand it to Silas. He turned it so Silas could see it from the wall, which was a reasonable distance but workable. "Halverson is in Pittsburgh. She's maintained the clearest position she has indicated. She will testify consistent with her original statement. But she also has a daughter who started at a university in the fall, which is a vulnerability. You told her that? We flagged it to her. She appreciated it." "What does appreciated it mean in terms of actual decision?" "She's in, but she wants weekly contact, not as needed." Silas looked at the second page. A name he recognized, Marcus Webb, who had been one of the field-level operatives in Voss's system, one of the people who'd actually been in the rooms, who had a particular kind of first-hand testimony that no amount of procedural argument could fully neutralize. "Webb is the uncertain one," Reese said. "He relocated 18 months ago. We found him, which means Ferraro probably found him. He hasn't confirmed or denied that he's been contacted. He's not answering the number we have for him. Has someone been there in person? We sent someone last week." Reese paused. Webb opened the door, looked at the ID, and closed the door. "Where is he?" Cho and Reese exchanged a look that lasted about 1 second. "We're not going to give you that," Cho said. "Why?" "Because the last time someone went outside the official structure to make contact with a witness, we spent 3 months untangling the evidentiary implications." She said, "It wasn't. But the precedent holds." Silas looked at her. "Marcus Webb is going to decide he's not testifying because the last time cost him something he hasn't finished paying for. And you're going to lose his testimony, which is the most specific and direct testimony you have. And Voss's lawyer is going to use that withdrawal as evidence of a systemic problem with the witness credibility. And the proceeding is going to come apart at a joint that was already stressed." He pushed off the wall. "Where is he?" "I trained Marcus Webb for 9 months, Silas said. "How he thinks, and I know what he needs to hear. And I know that whatever your official contact said last week when he held up an ID and Webb closed the door, I can say something different." He looked at Cho directly. "Where is he?" Silence in the room had a different quality than the earlier silences. This one had the specific texture of people, reconsidering positions they'd come in with. Reese looked at Cho. Cho looked at the closed tablet. "Dayton," she said. "Fairview area. I'll text the address to the phone we gave you." She looked up at him. "You go as a private individual, not as part of this proceeding." "I'm not part of this proceeding. Then we understand each other." He nodded once, moved toward the door. Mercer, Reese's voice. He stopped. Ferraro's still in the area. The car may be gone from your building, but he's not gone. That's a problem you can't resolve the way you resolve the problem. The problem at your gym Friday night. Silas looked at him. I know that too. He went out. The bus to Dayton ran at 11:15 and arrived at 1:40, which gave him 2.5 hours of transit time, which was more planning time than he usually had, and less than he would have preferred, given the complexity of what he was planning, which was not really a plan yet, so much as a direction, with some plausible steps roughed in around it. He sat in the back of the bus and watched Ohio go past through a window that needed cleaning and thought about Marcus Webb. Webb had been 24 when Silas had trained him. He was 31 now, which meant he'd been carrying the weight of this particular history for 7 years, which was roughly the same amount of time Silas had been carrying it, on a different part of the body. Silas carried his in his left knee and in the set of his hands in the morning, and in the specific category of 3 a.m. wake-ups that weren't nightmares exactly, but weren't nothing either. Webb, from what Silas had known of him, had always carried his things in a more visible place in the quality of his attention, the way he held eye contact too long when he was processing something difficult, particular set of his jaw when he was trying to contain something that wanted to be larger than the container. He'd been a good candidate. Genuine aptitude for the work, the right combination of spatial awareness and pattern recognition, and the specific kind of calm under pressure that wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to continue functioning while fear was present. Silas had told him so early on, yes, because in his experience, telling people the accurate truth about their capabilities was one of the few unambiguously useful things a trainer could do. And Webb had received it the way good candidates received accurate information, which was without theatrics. He'd also been, in Silas's experience of him, someone for whom the ethical dimension of the work was inseparable from the functional dimension. Everyone was like that. Some people could compartmentalize the two perfectly and function well in both compartments independently. Webb could not, which was not a flaw, it was actually, in Silas's considered assessment, a feature that made his judgment in the field more reliable, because people who integrated the two had a natural corrective that pure operators didn't, but it meant that when the ethical dimension became catastrophic, the functional one went with it. What had happened under Voss had been catastrophic by almost any coherent standard. Webb had seen things that couldn't be recategorized as acceptable by anyone with a functioning conscience, and had reported what he'd seen through the correct channels. And those channels had led to Silas, and Silas had carried it forward. And what the proceeding had cost Webb, in terms of his career and his life, and the version of himself he'd been before any of it, Silas did not have full visibility on. He had a reasonable estimate. The bus passed a water tower with a town name on it that Silas didn't recognize. He looked at his own phone, the regular one, and thought about calling ahead. Decided against it. A call could be declined. A knock on a door could be closed. Yes, he'd intervened. Neither of those could continue the conversation. But a person standing on a doorstep had a different kind of gravity, and he needed gravity for this one. The address in Fairview was a duplex on a residential street of duplexes, the kind of neighborhood that existed in a stable middle state between its better years and whatever came next, with trees large enough to indicate genuine time passing and lawns maintained to a standard that said, "I live here," without saying, "I'm proud of it." The unit on the left had window boxes with something that had been flowers and was now dried stalks. The unit on the right had a truck in the driveway that was roughly the same vintage as Silas's own, which felt like information without being useful information. He knocked on the left unit's door. 30 seconds. He knocked again. The door opened on a chain, one eye visible through the gap. Brown careful looking at Silas with the specific quality of someone who had spent the last week opening doors to varying degrees and finding the experience universally unpleasant. With Marcus, Silas said. A long silence. Mercer. Webb's voice was lower than it had been at 24. Just older, it had the register of someone who'd been keeping it quiet for a long time. You look like hell. You're looking at me through a door chain. Pause. The door closed and Silas heard the chain come off, and the door opened the rest of the way. Marcus Webb at 31 was about what Silas had extrapolated from the math, same height, same build. Everything that had been taught in him was now held differently. The way structures changed when they'd been under sustained load for a long period without relief. He was wearing a flannel shirt in August, which told Silas something about the state of the interior air conditioning and/or the state of Webb's internal thermostat, which had always run cold under stress. "You alone?" Webb asked, looking past Silas at the street. "He sent you." "Nobody sent me," Silas said, which was accurate in the specific way that mattered. "Can I come in?" Webb stepped back. The inside of the duplex had the organized quality of someone who had moved in with the intention of not accumulating things. Furniture but minimal. A kitchen table with 2 chairs. Couch facing a TV that was off. Bookshelves mutant Caesar, the one category where the minimalism had not held 3 of them, full, which was Silas noted because it told him how Webb had been spending the time he wasn't spending on other things. "I closed the door on your people last week," Webb said. He went to the kitchen and didn't offer coffee, which was fine. "I'm going to tell you the same thing I would have told them if I'd opened it more than 6 inches. Tell me." Webb turned from the counter and looked at him. His jaw was doing that thing it used to do, the contained pressure thing. "I'm not doing it again." The testimony. I am not sitting in another room and telling another set of people what I saw and waiting to find out which part of my life they're going to take next in exchange for the privilege of being believed. Silas sat down at the kitchen table without being invited. His knee registered the chair as an improvement over standing without commenting further. "What did they take last time?" he said. Webb looked at him. "What they took? I know what I know. Tell me what you know." A long pause. Webb pulled out the second chair, turned it backwards, straddled it with his arms across the back. The way people sat when they were trying to have a conversation they'd decided not to have. "My career, obviously. Couldn't stay in anything adjacent to the work after." "Fine. I'd already figured that part out before I testified. That was a known cost." He stopped. "My marriage, which that was already under strain, that's not on the proceeding. But the timing of everything didn't help, and the 18 months of not being able to tell her what was actually happening, or why we were moving, or why I couldn't talk to certain people. Yeah. Didn't help. I'm sorry about that," Silas said. "It's not your fault. I know it's not. I'm sorry anyway." Webb looked at the table, at the wood grain, which had a gouge in it from something that had happened before. Webb had put the table there, evidence of someone else's previous moment that had been absorbed into the furniture and become just a mark. "My brother called me last month," he said, out of nowhere. "We hadn't talked in 2 years. He called and he said someone had reached out to him asking questions about me, and I spent 4 days wondering if that was Ferraro or if it was your people, and I didn't know which one to be more worried about. And that..." He stopped. "That's what I mean. That's the thing. I can't anymore. I can't live in the space where I don't know which threat is which." "Then why are you here?" Silas looked at him directly. "Because if you don't testify, Harlan Voss walks out of a hearing room in 62 days with his conviction vacated, and the body of what he did gets recharacterized as a procedural failure rather than what it actually was. I know that, and because the 3 witnesses, they've already gotten to 2 of them, were more peripheral than you. Your testimony is the one that doesn't have workarounds." He paused. "Voss knows that, which is why Ferraro went to your brother." Webb's jaw worked. "He's not going to stop at your brother," Silas said. "Withdrawing from the proceeding doesn't make you safe. It makes you a loose end without protection." The room was quiet. Webb got up from the chair and went to the window, the one that faced the side yard, not the street, and stood with his arms crossed, looking at whatever was out there. A fence, probably. August grass. Nothing interesting. "What happened to you?" he said. "After? You're cleaning floors in a strip mall?" "That's it, that's your hole." "It's honest work," Silas said. Quiet. It doesn't ask me for anything I don't have left. Webb turned from the window. He looked at Silas with an expression that had several things in it. At once, none of them simple. You came all the way to Dayton to tell me to testify. I came to tell you that I'm testifying, whatever you decide. I wanted you to know that before you decided. Something changed in Webb's face. Dramatically, nothing dramatic happened in Webb's face. That was one of the constants Silas remembered from training him. But something shifted in the specific way that information shifted things when it was the right information at the right moment. You're going, Webb said. Yes, after what happened last time. After the parking structure. After all of it, Silas said. Because the alternative is that it meant nothing. And I'm not willing to accept that it meant nothing. A long silence. You're still doing that, Webb said. That thing where you just state what you're going to do and wait. Is it working? Webb let out a short breath that was almost a laugh and not quite. He looked at the bookshelves, 3 shelves of accumulated reading time, years of it, the thing he'd filled the hours with, when the hours needed filling. Then he looked back at Silas. I need certain things, Webb said. Specific things, not generic assurances about resource allocation. Write them down, Silas said. I'll take the list back to Cho. Cho is running this. She's running the oversight. Webb's expression produced a specific opinion about that which he decided not to put into words. He went to the kitchen counter and found a notepad, the kind with the spiral binding, grocery list size, and a pen, and stood at the counter writing. His handwriting was the same as Silas remembered it. Small, densely packed, the handwriting of someone who had learned to fit a lot of content into a small space. He wrote for about 4 minutes. Tore the page off, handed it to Silas. 7 items. Silas read them. 3 of them were things that would require escalation above Cho's level to authorize. 2 of them were operationally straightforward. 1 of them was about his brother, which was the simplest one and the most important. The last one was 3 words that Silas read twice. Tell me why. Why what? Silas asked. Why you testified the first time, Webb said. I know why I did. I was 24. I thought the structure worked. I thought reporting what I'd seen was what the structure was for. And then I found out what the structure was actually for, which was maintaining itself. He was looking at Silas steadily. You were older. You'd been in it longer. You knew what it was. Silas folded the list carefully, put it in his jacket pocket. He thought about a room in a building that didn't officially exist, in which he had watched Harlan Voss give an instruction that had resulted in the death of a person who had not needed to die, and had watched 4 other people in the room find separate ways to not have seen what they just seen, and had stood in that room afterward, in the specific quality of silence that followed an action that could not be taken back, and had known with absolute certainty that he was about to do something that was going to cost him more than he could currently calculate. Because someone had to, he said. Webb looked at him for a long moment. That's it, he said. That's the whole thing. Yeah. Silence, different from the others, less pressurized, more like something releasing rather than building. Webb looked at the window, then back at Silas. I'll think about it, he said. Give Cho the list. Tell her, I'll answer the phone if she calls in the next 48 hours. Silas stood up. His knee registered the standing without protest. Thank you, he said. Don't, Webb said. I haven't decided anything. He moved toward the door. One more thing. The brother. What's his name? Webb frowned slightly. Why? Give me his number. Ferraro went to him once. If he goes again, Danny should have a number to call. Pause. Webb looked at him with the expression of someone recalibrating something. He went back to the notepad and wrote number and tore it off and handed it over. Silas pocketed it. The bus back runs at 4:10, Webb said. It was 3:47 by the kitchen clock. I know. Then you should go. He went. Outside, the Dayton afternoon was doing the same thing the Greyhaven morning had been doing, which was pressing down with the full weight of August in a landlocked state. He walked to the bus stop, 3 blocks over, and stood in the partial shade of a building overhang and looked at the street, which was residential street doing nothing more than being a residential street on a Thursday afternoon. Took out the notepad page with the 7 items and read it again. The last item. Tell me why. He'd answered it as honestly as he knew how. It hadn't sounded like enough. Standing in that kitchen. It rarely sounded like enough. Because someone had to was not an answer that satisfied most people's need for a more complete accounting for principle, for conviction. He'd intervened for the kind of moral architecture that could bear the weight of everything that had followed from acting on it. It was the true one. He'd learned, over a long career of training people, to do things that were genuinely difficult, that the true answers were almost never the satisfying ones, and that the satisfying answers were almost never the ones that held up under the conditions that actually mattered. Put the list back in his pocket. The 4:10 bus arrived at 4:12, which was the closest thing to on time that the route offered, and Silas got on and took the back seat and watched Ohio reassemble itself in reverse as the bus headed north toward Gray Haven. His phone buzzed. A text to the Reese phone, from Cho Ferraro's vehicle located. Commercial District, Carver Street area. He looked at that. Then he looked out the window. Carver Street was 2 blocks from the building they'd met in this morning. The building with the papered-over windows and the pressed tin ceiling and the 2 chairs at the table that Silas had declined to sit in. Ferraro hadn't followed him to Dayton. Ferraro had gone back to the last known meeting point and was sitting on it, which meant either he didn't know about Webb's location yet, or he'd decided that Silas was the more useful thing to track. Both of those options had implications. He texted back, "Don't move the car." Spook him. I'm 2 hours out. He put the phone in his pocket. Closed his eyes, which he did sometimes on buses and trains, and in the back seats of vehicles when he had thinking to do that, benefited from the removal of visual input, and let the motion of the bus carry him north while his mind worked through the geometry of what came next. Was a version of this that resolved cleanly. Webb testifies. Halvorsen testifies. The 2 remaining witnesses hold. The proceeding goes forward on its new timeline with adequate testimony. The appeal fails. Voss goes back to Leavenworth to serve out what he'd been given. There was another version. Silas kept his eyes closed and worked through the other version, the way you worked, through things that needed to be understood before they happened rather than after. And when the bus pulled into the Gray Haven Central stop at 6:28, he had a clear enough picture of both versions that he knew which one required what, and what his specific role in either one was going to be. He got off the bus, stood in the 6:30 evening air of Gray Haven, Ohio, which had finally, reluctantly, released some of the day's heat, the temperature dropping to something that was only unpleasant rather than aggressive. Strip Mall on Route 9 was about 1.5 miles north. He thought about the mop with the wobbling left wheel. He thought about the glove sitting in the center of the mat that he'd worked around without touching. He thought about a 19-year-old kid with a bruised cheekbone and a full piece of supper in his pocket, and whether that kid had called the number yet. He hoped he had. He took out his own phone and navigated to the contacts and found the one he'd never called, and Ness stood there for a moment with his thumb over it. Then he called it. It rang 3 times. Foundry, said, a voice like gravel and old leather and about 4 decades of telling people they were wrong about what they were capable of. Cal, Silas said. It's Silas Mercer. I need to ask you a favor. Pause. Mercer, Cal Rourke said, and the way he said it contained an entire compressed history. I figured you'd turn up eventually. A kid named Eli Dawson is going to call you, Silas said. Maybe already did. 19 years old, decent hands, bad weight distribution, worse mental habits. He needs someone who's going to rebuild him from the ground up and not make it about the cameras. Uh-huh, Cal said. And you're asking because I'm not going to be available for a while. A long pause. How long's a while, Cal said. Silas looked at the street. The ordinary Thursday evening machinery of Gray Haven moving past him, cars, a dog being walked, someone's porch light coming on in the early dusk. I'm not sure yet, he said. Cal grunted. It was the grunt of a man who had heard that answer before in various forms and had learned not to press on it. "Send the kid," he said. "If he's serious, I'll keep him. If he's not, I'll know inside 2 weeks." "He's serious," Silas said. "You always said that about people." "I was usually right." "Usually," Cal said, with the particular weight of someone who remembered the exceptions. "Thank you, Cal. Don't thank me. Pay the gym fee. Kid pays his own way. I don't do charity cases. Tell him I said that's fair." He ended the call. He stood on the sidewalk in the early evening in Greyhaven, Ohio, with the Reese phone in one pocket and the list with 7 items in the other, and Danny Webb's number folded into the back section of his wallet. And he looked at the direction of Carver Street, which was east from where he was standing, and thought about a silver car, parked 2 blocks from a building with papered windows. He thought about what Reese had said. "That's a problem you can't resolve, the way you resolved the problem at your gym Friday night." He knew that. He also knew that the problem at the gym Friday night had not been resolved by the 12 seconds on the mat. It had been resolved by the hour before it, by a kid adjusting his weight distribution in the middle of a water break, and a folding chair at the edge of a mat, and a brief conversation about what training was actually for. 12 seconds had been the visible part. The invisible part was where the actual work had happened. Started walking, not toward Carver Street, toward Route 9 and north, because there was a shift log at Iron Harbor Combat Club with his name on it for tomorrow morning at 4:51. He had not yet decided whether he would be there to sign it, and he wanted to make that decision deliberately, rather than by default. His left knee found its rhythm against the pavement, and the evening settled in around him, and Greyhaven did what it did, which was continue being Greyhaven indifferent. Ordinary, its particular brand of unremarkable persistence that had nothing to do with him, and everything with simply being a place that kept going regardless of what any one person inside it was carrying. No. He walked for about 6 blocks before his own phone buzzed. Text from a number he didn't recognize, with a 937 area code. "This is Eli," I called the number. "He said to show up Saturday at 9. He also said you're a pain in the ass. I assume that means you talked to him?" Silas read it twice. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and kept walking, and something in his chest that had been held at a particular tension since 4:51 that morning released itself by one small, specific degree. Enough to matter, probably, but enough. He texted back one word, "good," and kept walking. The evening had settled into that particular Ohio quality that arrived sometimes in late August. Yes, he intervened. When the heat finally stopped fighting, and the air went soft, and the light went amber, and everything looked like it had been shot through a filter that made ordinary things appear briefly significant. Power lines against pale sky, a barbershop with its light still on. A woman on a second-floor balcony watering something that needed water. Silas walked through it and did not find it beautiful exactly, but acknowledged it the way you acknowledged something that was doing what it was supposed to do. He had decisions to make before morning. The first one was Ferraro. The second one was the shift log. They were connected, which was the problem. Because if Ferraro was sitting on Carver Street, watching the last place he'd seen Silas returning to any predictable location, including a strip mall on Route 9 at 4:51 in the morning, was handing Ferraro the kind of pattern that made a man in Ferraro's particular line of work very comfortable. Stopped at the payphone outside the Sunoco station, which was one of maybe 4 payphones still operational in Greyhaven, and which he had noted in his second week as a piece of infrastructure worth cataloging, for reasons that had seemed abstract then and were less abstract now. He called Reese's number from memory rather than using the Reese phone, because using the Reese phone for this created a record in a system he didn't fully control. "Ferraro's still on Carver?" he said when Reese picked up. "Far as we know, we have eyes on the street, not the car directly. How many people do you have in Greyhaven right now?" 3, including me. That's not enough to pick him up. We're not in the business of picking people up, Mercer. No. We don't have that authority in this context, and you know it. Thought for a moment. Does Cho have a contact with the Greyhaven PD? Pause. Why? Because Ferraro is a private citizen without a reason to be in this town. And if someone gave the local PD a specific plate number and a location and a description of why that vehicle was associated with a suspicious pattern of activity in the area, the incident at my apartment building this morning, for instance, then the PD has both the authority and the motivation to have a conversation with him that doesn't require any of us to be involved. A longer pause. That's clean, Reese said, with a quality in his voice that suggested he wasn't entirely happy about not having thought of it first. It's the right kind of clean. It doesn't make him disappear, and it doesn't escalate. It just introduces friction into his ability to operate here unobserved. I'll run it by Cho. Run it fast. I need to know by 0400 whether my morning routine is compromised. A beat. Webb? He'll answer the phone if Cho calls in the next 48 hours. He has a list of specific requirements. I'm sending them to this number. When I get somewhere, I can take a photo. Specific how? Specific enough that two of them will require escalation above Cho's level. Tell her that up front, before she calls him. He'll know if she's stalling. Understood. He hung up, stood for a moment in the Sunoco's exterior light, which was the harsh, efficient light of a gas station that had converted to LED and not looked back, kind of light that didn't flatter anything, but did illuminate it with a completeness that was a virtue. He bought a bottle of water inside and walked to his apartment building via the street route rather than the alley. Yes, he'd intervened, because Ferraro was on Carver Street, and the alley exit had been the route he used that morning, and he was not going to establish patterns in the locations he'd already to break patterns. He went in through the front entrance, which meant passing the parking lot where the silver car had been, which was empty now. The car was gone. The space still had the ghost quality of a recently vacated surveillance position that Silas felt more than saw. He photographed the list on his kitchen table and sent it. Made the stovetop coffee too late in the evening for it. But his body's relationship with caffeine was one of many things that had been permanently altered by years of irregular sleep. And the coffee at this hour was less about wakefulness and more about the particular comfort of a process he understood. Poured it. Stewed at the counter. He thought about what tomorrow looked like in either version. Cho called at 11:40. The PD contact is workable, she said without preamble. We have a prior relationship with a Lieutenant Bowman at Greyhaven PD through an unrelated matter. He's being briefed on a need-to-know basis tonight. The plate has been flagged. If Ferraro is in that car in the city limits after 0600 tomorrow, Bowman's people will have cause to approach. Gives him tonight. It gives him tonight, she agreed. Which is why I'd suggest you not be at a predictable location tonight. I'm at my apartment. Is that predictable? He's seen it. But he doesn't know I know he's seen it, which changes the calculation. He paused. He won't come tonight. It's too direct and too traceable. Whatever Ferraro is, he's not stupid, no, Cho said. A brief pause, the kind with paper shuffling sounds behind it. The list from Webb. Yes. 3 of the 7 items I can authorize right now. 2 more I can get authorized by end of business tomorrow. Yes, he'd intervened. The brother thing is straightforward. We can have someone make contact Danny Webb tonight if you give us the number. He read it to her from memory. The last 2 items, she said. The relocation provision and the career path consultation. The relocation I can get authorized. It'll take 4 days. Tell him 3, Silas said. He'll accept 3 if it comes with a specific name attached to the authorization, someone he can call directly. A relay number. A pause. That's not standard protocol. Standard protocol is why he closed the door last week. A longer pause. I'll attach my name, Cho said. And she said it the way someone said something that's decided they should have decided a long time ago. Career path consultation. That's going to be a harder conversation at the level it needs to happen. But it's on the list, which means it matters to him, which means it needs to be on the table when you call him, even if the answer is, we're working on it. Mercer, she paused again. Why are you doing this? You could have handed me the list and stepped back. He thought about how to answer that, because Webb testified the first time, because he believed someone was going to hold up their end of the thing. And the end didn't hold. He looked at the kitchen window, at the dark parking lot outside. Someone should have done this 7 years ago, showed up in person, and said, I know what it cost, and here's what I'm going to do to make sure this time is different. A silence. I'll call Webb at 9 a.m. tomorrow, Cho said, with everything on the list that's been authorized, and a timeline on the rest. Thank you. Don't. She sounded tired in a way that was not tonight's tiredness. Get some sleep. He did, eventually. His alarm went off at 4. He lay in the dark for a moment, the way he always lay in the dark for a moment before getting up, not because he needed time to wake up, but because the transition from horizontal to vertical was one of those places where the body reported its condition without editing, and he'd learned to listen to that unedited version before he started asking it to do things. Left knee, present and registered. 3 out of 10, manageable. Everything else functional. He got up, made coffee from the stovetop pot, dressed in his work clothes, which were exactly as gray and unremarkable as they always were, and checked both phones, and found a text from Reese on the Reese phone. Bowman's people located the vehicle at 0317. Driver not present. Car has been flagged for observation. If he returns to it, after 0600, they'll approach. Which meant Ferraro had spent part of the night somewhere other than the silver car. Which meant he was either done with Greyhaven, or he was operating on foot, neither of which was information Silas could fully act on, but both of which he filed. He texted back, understood, proceeding with normal shift. He went to Iron Harbor at 4:51. The wobbling left wheel of the mop bucket announced itself. The second, he pulled it from the storage room, and he corrected for it automatically, the way he always corrected for it. Started at the back. He always started. The gym was the same. The mats, the logo, the 4 camera angles, the expensive equipment that communicated something about its owner's priorities. Pressed tin smell of the cleaning products and the body spray residue, and underneath it, the specific smell of foam mat material that was the smell of every gym Silas had ever been in, from the ones he'd trained in at 19 to the ones he'd run at 32 to this one, where he pushed a mop with a broken wheel at 4:51 in the morning. He cleaned, methodically, completely. At 6:15, Cole came in and nodded at the equipment. 6:23, Mara arrived and went behind the front desk without speaking. At 6:29, Silas went to the front desk and set his badge and the daily log on the counter. Mara looked at the badge, looked at him. You're not signing out. Your shift ends at 9. I'm signing out now, he said. There's a supply request in the back for a mop head. It's been due for 3 weeks. I'd appreciate it if someone followed up on that, for whoever comes after me. Mara looked at him for a long moment. She had, in 6 weeks of morning shifts, said approximately 40 words to him that weren't logistical. Yes, he'd intervened, and in all 40 of those words he had gotten the impression of a woman who saw considerably more than she acknowledged seeing and had made a deliberate professional choice to keep those two things separated. The thing Friday night, she said. Yes, I saw the end of it. I was coming out of the back. She looked at the badge on the counter. I've worked here 3 years. I know. He does that thing. She stopped. Started differently. He's done that thing to 4 people that I remember. All of them left. I know that too. You're not going to press charges or... She looked at the log, at the badge, back at him. Okay, she said. It was a small word doing a lot of work. She slid the log across the counter. He signed it. She took the badge and put it in the drawer without looking at it. Take care of yourself, Mr. Mercer, and she said, and went back to her screen. He went out the side door. The hearing was in Cincinnati, which was 2 hours south, in a federal building with the specific architectural energy of federal buildings. Everywhere the kind of permanence that was supposed to communicate stability, and instead mostly communicated the significant cost of maintaining marble floors. Silas the day before. He was staying in a mid-range hotel 3 blocks from the building, the kind with an ice machine on every floor, and a breakfast bar that opened at 6, and a gym that had 2 treadmills and a set of dumbbells and he ran through his mobility work on the hotel room floor and slept adequately and woke at 4:15 with his heart steady and the ceiling above him doing nothing except being a ceiling. He thought about what he was going to say. He had said it before 7 years ago. Different heat room, under different conditions, to different people. Content had not changed because the facts had not changed. Facts were, in Silas's experience, the most structurally sound things available to human beings. And the reason most of what went wrong in the world went wrong was not that the facts were absent, but that people with something to lose found creative ways to not see them. He was going to say what he had seen, in the order he had seen it, without embellishment and without diminishment. He was going to do this in a room where Harlan Voss would present. Yes, he had thought about what that would be like. He had not spent a large amount of time thinking about it, because in his experience, excessive anticipation of confrontation was a way of doing the confrontation twice, once in your head badly and once in reality adequately. The version in your head never had useful fidelity. He had thought about it enough to know what he expected. Voss composed, because Voss had spent a career composing himself under pressure. Voss's lawyer active, because that was what Voss's lawyer was being paid for. The room itself managed, clean, official, stripped of everything except the procedural machinery of it. And himself, older than the last time, which he would feel in his knee when he stood for long periods. Quieter than the last time, which 7 years of early mornings and empty gym floors had built into him at a structural level. Less certain of some things than the last time, which was the honest cost of having watched certainty fail to protect people he'd believed were protected. Still there, still with the same set of facts in the same order, still at the bottom of it, because someone had to be. Marcus Webb arrived the morning of the hearing. Silas saw him in the lobby of the federal building at 8:40 minutes before they were required to be anywhere. Was in a G-suit that fit him less well than it had probably fit him when he'd bought it. Yes, he'd intervened, and he was standing near the building directory with his hands in his pockets and the look of a man who had made a decision he wasn't entirely at peace with and had decided to honor it anyway, which was the only way Silas had ever seen Webb make decisions, and which was, in Silas's estimate, one of the more reliable forms of resolve available. They shook hands. "You look better than you did in Dayton," Silas said. "You look exactly the same as you did in Dayton," Webb said. "Is that good or bad? Honestly, I can't tell." They stood in the lobby for a moment. Around them, the building did its morning business lawyers with briefcases, clerks with coffee, the general ambient machinery of a place that processed things. "Cho called," Webb said. 9 a.m. sharp, like you said. And she attached her name to 3 things on the list. The relocations confirmed. "Danny's been contacted. He called me after. Said a woman came by the house. Very professional. He showed ID. You gave him a number." "No." He paused. He said she looked like someone who meant it. "Good. The career consultation thing is under active discussion at the appropriate level." Which means probably not. Webb agreed. But she said it without flinching, which I appreciated. I've been lied to by people who flinched. She didn't flinch. "She's not the problem," Silas said. "She never was the problem. She was part of a system that had the problem in it." Webb looked at the directory. "Is that supposed to make me feel better about being here?" Silas said. "Nothing's supposed to make you feel better about being here. You're here because it's the right thing, and the right thing is often uncomfortable. That's about all the comfort I can offer you." Webb looked at him. "You always were a terrible pep talk. I know. You were a good trainer, though." He said it quietly, without sentimentality, the way you stated a fact that you'd had a long time to verify. "Whatever happened after, you were a good trainer." Silas looked at him for a moment. "Go get some water," he said. "Testimony's long, your throat gets dry." Webb almost smiled. Still telling people what to do. Someone has to. Webb went to find the water, and Silas stood in the lobby and looked at the building directory without reading it, and let the morning organize itself around him. The hearing lasted most of the day. Silas testified in the afternoon, third of 4 witnesses, after a technical analyst who had reconstructed communications records, and before Halverson, who had flown in from Pittsburgh, and who looked, when Silas passed her in the hallway, like someone who had been through this before and intended to go through it again without losing anything additional. He sat in the witness chair and looked at the room. Voss was across from him at the respondent's table. 61 years old, which showed in the face but not the posture, because Voss had always what his posture communicated and maintained the decision regardless of circumstances. He was watching Silas with an expression that was professionally neutral, and underneath the professional neutrality was something that Silas recognized and did not give a name to. Their eyes met, held for a moment. Silas looked at the committee. He stated his name, his previous role, his relationship to the original proceeding. He stated the date in question. He stated what he had been present for and what he had observed and what he had heard Harlan of Voss instruct, and what had followed from that instruction in sequence, accurately, used without embellishment. He was asked questions. He answered them. Voss's lawyer was good, methodical, precise, doing what the job required, which was to find the seams and press them. Silas answered every question from the same place he answered all questions, which was the place where the facts were. There were no seams to find because there was only one version, and the one version was the same version it had always been, which was the version of what had actually happened. This took about 90 minutes. Afterward, in the hallway, Reese appeared from somewhere and walked beside him toward the elevator without saying anything for about 30 feet. Webb's was strong, Reese said finally. Morning session. His counsel tried the pre-briefed narrative angle on Cross, and Webb he paused, searching for the right word. He just described what he saw. Exactly. 3 times. 3 different ways. Because they asked him to repeat it, and all 3 versions were the same. After the 3rd one, they moved on. That's Webb, Silas said. Committee's not issuing a finding today. Probably end of next week. They stood at the elevator. Reese pressed the button. What do you do now? He asked. It wasn't a procedural question. Silas thought about it honestly. I have a shift on Monday, he said. Reese looked at him. Seriously. I took a different assignment. Different building downtown, closer to Millard Street. He looked at the elevator doors. Better hours. The elevator arrived. They got in. Reese pressed 3. Silas pressed the lobby. Ferraro, Reese said as the doors closed. He was picked up by Greyhaven PD Thursday morning. They found him in the vehicle on the 3rd pass. He had items in the car that constituted end of surveillance activity photographs, notes. PD is holding him on a local charge, while the appropriate people figure out whether there's a federal dimension. There's a federal dimension, Silas said. Almost certainly, Reese agreed. The elevator stopped at 3. The doors opened. Reese put a hand on the frame, not getting out yet. For what it's worth, he said, the structural changes after the first preceding the ones I mentioned. They happened because of what happened to you. The parking structure. The 11 months of procedural stall. He paused. Took longer than it should have, but they happened. Silas looked at him. Tell me that in 2 years, he said. When we see if they held. Reese looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, stepped out, and let the doors close. Silas rode to the lobby alone. He was back in Greyhaven by 7. He drove the F-150 up Route 9 past the strip mall, the way you drove past something that used to be part of your daily structure and was no longer specific quality of attention that wasn't nostalgia, because nostalgia required a warmth that wasn't present here, but that wasn't nothing either. He drove past and looked through the windshield at the Iron Harbor sign red on black, the anchor, the aggressive block letters, and kept driving. The sign was still on. The parking lot had 4 cars in it. The gym was still operating. Brandon Kade had not disappeared. Silas had not expected him to. Like Brandon, in Silas's experience, were more structurally persistent than they appeared when you were looking directly at them, because what they were built on the ego, The fear behind the ego. The particular hunger for a kind of respect they'd confused with fear was the kind of foundation that didn't collapse just because someone had walked onto the mat and made a point. It cracked. The crack spread. But the timeline was slower than a single Friday night. He knew this because he'd watched it happen before, in other contexts, with other Brandons. What he also knew was that he'd done what he could do. He had not done it cleanly. There was the knee, which had spent most of the following week telling him in detail about the mat sprawl, the specific image of Brandon on the floor of his own gym that Silas had been unable to entirely evaluate without some awareness of what it cost a man to be seen that way in front of his people. He did not feel good about that part. He felt it had been necessary, and he felt the necessary thing could be ugly, and both of those things were true at the same time without canceling each other out. He pulled into the parking lot of the Millard Street building at 7:20. Foundry Boxing Hall was in the basement, accessed by a staircase on the east side of the building that had a sign that was not much more than lettering on painted wood, which had been the sign since Khaled had put it there sometime in the mid-'80s, and which he had declined to update, on the grounds that anyone who was serious enough to find the place would find it regardless of signage, and anyone who needed a fancier sign to find it probably needed a fancier gym. Silas went down the stairs. He stood in the doorway. The basement was what it had always been: concrete floor, low ceiling, the smell of canvas and old leather and iron, and the specific atmospheric product of decades of hard work in a contained space. Mirrors, 2 heavy bags hung from ceiling mounts that had been there long enough to have bent slightly under the sustained load. A speed bag in the corner, a ring, real ropes, scuff marks on the canvas from 1,000 sessions of people learning what they were made of. Cal Rourke was standing at the edge of the ring with his arms crossed, watching the only other person in the room, who was working the heavy bag in the far corner. Eli Dawson. He was in shorts and a worn gray t-shirt, his hands taped, working the bag with the methodical rhythm of someone who had been given a specific combination to drill, and was drilling it without anyone watching. Left jab, right cross. Step left, jab again. His weight was centered. His footwork was not graceful, it was deliberate, concentrated. The footwork of someone actively thinking about where each foot went, rather than letting it go there naturally, which was exactly where you were supposed to be in the first week of rebuilding a foundation from scratch. Cal looked over at Silas in the doorway. He was 73, 74, with the specific kind of age that happened to men who had spent their lives in physical work not diminished, rearranged. Shorter than Silas remembered, or maybe just more settled into himself, gravity having made its claims over the decades, and Cal having made his peace with the terms. His hair was white. His hands looked like they'd been made out of something denser than regular human material. He walked over to Silas without rushing. They looked at each other for a moment. "You look old," Cal said. "You look older," Silas said. "I am older." He looked back at Eli, who was still working the bags, still in the rhythm. Kid showed up at 8 Saturday morning, 30 minutes before I opened. Was sitting on the stairs when I came down. He was early. He said you told him the session was at 9. I told him the session was at 9. He showed up at 8. Cal turned back to Silas. He's got decent hands. Bad habits from wherever he was before I spent 2 days just taking things apart before I could start putting anything in. He doesn't like that. But he keeps doing it. He'll keep doing it, Silas said. You sure about that? Silas watched Eli work the bag. Combination again, jab, cross, step, jab. It was not impressive. It was not supposed to be impressive yet. It was supposed to be correct, which it was getting closer to with each repetition, the way anything got closer to correct with enough honest repetition, which was not a secret but was apparently something people kept needing to be told. Silas said, I'm sure, Cal grunted. He told me about the gym he was at. What happened Friday night? He looked at Silas with a specific look that was the look of a man who had known another man for decades and had a reasonably complete accounting of what that man was capable of. You stepped on the mat. Yes. After how many years is off? Quite a few. How'd that go? It went. Cal shook his head slowly, not in disappointment, but in the particular way of someone who recognized a pattern they'd been watching for a long time. You never could just walk past something. No, Silas said. Couldn't. They stood side by side in the doorway of a basement gym on a Thursday evening in Greyhaven, Ohio, watching a 19-year-old boy work a heavy bag in the methodical way of someone who was building something from nothing and knew it and hadn't decided that was too slow. After a minute, Eli noticed them. He stopped the combination, dropped his hands, turned. He looked at Silas with an expression that was too complicated to summarize, the same expression that had been developing across the days since Friday, acquiring layers with each thing that had happened, which had been several things, and not all of them small. "You're back," Eli said. "For now," Silas said. He looked at him. "How long's for now?" It was the same question Cal had asked him on the phone, the same one Webb had asked, different form, the same one Silas had been asking himself for 11 days in the spaces between the other questions. He thought about the shift on Monday, the downtown building, the better hours, the 3 blocks from street. He thought about a mop buck with a functioning wheel, which he intended to confirm before he committed to anything. "Enough," he said. Eli held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded a small nod, the real kind, the kind that meant something had been received rather than just heard. He turned back to the bag. Jab, cross, step, jab. Cal moved back into the gym and picked up a piece of chalk from the ledge beside the ring and wrote something on the small blackboard above the speed bag that he used for training notes. Silas couldn't read it from the doorway. He didn't need to. He looked at the room for a moment more, the 2 heavy bags, the ring with its worn canvas, the low ceiling. The smell was the smell of all the work that had ever happened here and all the work that still would. Then he went back up the stairs. Outside, Route 9 was moving through its evening routine. Headlights going north and south, the distant orange glow of the Sunoco sign. The August heat beginning, finally, after weeks' treatings, to negotiate its terms with the approaching season, not surrendering, not yet, but acknowledging that something was coming. He stood on the sidewalk for a minute. He had a shift on Monday at a building downtown. He had a knee that was going to report on Monday, the way it reported every Monday, with the full inventory of the weekend's demands delivered without editorial. He had the Reese phone in his pocket that he intended to return once the proceeding resolved, and his own phone in the other pocket with one new text from a number in Pittsburgh. Halvorsen, he's testimony complete. If you need anything from me for the record, you have this number. He hadn't met her. He would probably never meet her. That was fine. So if he had a conversation he'd had in a federal building hallway with David Reese, and the specific quality of Reese's nod when Silas had said, "Tell me that in 2 years," which had been the nod of someone accepting a condition rather than deflecting one. He had enough. Not everything. Not the version of this that had no costs or loose ends or 3 a.m. accounting sessions. That version didn't exist and had never existed, and he had stopped looking for it sometime in the middle of a career that it had taken most of what it required and left him. At the far end of it, standing on a sidewalk in a mid-size Ohio town with a functional left knee and a Monday shift. He had enough. 2 weeks later, the committee issued its finding. The appeal was denied. The conviction was affirmed. Harlan Voss would serve the remainder of his sentence, and whatever legal avenues remained to him after that were significantly narrower than the ones that had just closed. Silas read about it in the way he read most things, plainly, without ceremony. Reese sent a single text, "Done." Silas responded in kind and then deleted the thread, which was the last thing he did with the Reese phone before putting it in an envelope and mailing it to the address Cho had given him for exactly that purpose. He was on his morning shift when the text came through. 3rd floor of the downtown building. The conference rooms, the ones that looked south over a slice of Greyhaven's modest skyline. And, if you were at the right window, the beginning of Millard Street, 3 blocks down. He read it, put the phone in his pocket, kept working. The floor was clean in the way. Floors were clean when someone paid attention to them, which was not perfectly because nothing was perfectly clean, but clean enough, functional, honest. He pushed the bucket to the next room. Wheel rolled without wobble. On a Saturday morning 2 months after that, Silas came down the stairs of the Millard Street building and took the chair Cal kept by the ring for observers, a folding chair, metal, the same model in a different color that he'd used in Iron Harbor, and sat and watched Eli Dawson spar. Brandon Kade, a training partner his own age, roughly his own size, from the small pool of serious students Cal kept. Yes, he didn't mean and men sparring had the quality of actual learning rather than performance, both of them, making mistakes and absorbing corrections and making different mistakes and finding, occasionally, right thing, the thing that landed correctly, because every preceding repetition had been pointing toward it. Eli wasn't good yet. He was going to be good. Those were related but different facts, and the space between them was where the work was, and he was in the work. The work was doing what work did when it was honest. Cal came and stood beside the chair. Didn't sit. He watched the round through to the bell and said nothing until the bell. He figured out the pivot yesterday, Cal said. Took him 3 weeks. Thought it was going to take 5. He's a fast learner when he stops trying to look like one, Silas said. Cal watched Eli go to the water bucket. You going to train him yourself eventually? Silas said. That's your job. I'm getting old. You've been getting old for 30 years. You'll outlast us both. Cal made a sound that was the Greyhaven basement gym equivalent of a laugh. He went back to the ring for the next round. Silas sat in the folding chair and watched. Eli caught his eye once, round, so the brief second between exchanges, and then went back to what he was doing, which was what you did. You registered the thing. And then you came back to the task, because the task was where the point was, and everything else was support for the task. The bell rang again. Silas stood, his left knee provided its report, which he received and filed, picked up the chair and returned it to the wall and went back up the stairs, and the sound of the gym followed him up into the street and then was replaced by the sound of a Thursday morning in Greyhaven, which was the sound of ordinary life continuing in the persistent, unremarkable way that ordinary life continued, indifferent to anyone's story. He walked toward the bus stop. The thing that mattered most was never the moment anyone else witnessed. It was always the one that happened before it in an empty gym, in a chair at the edge of a mat, in the half-second of a water break, when someone made one small adjustment and felt, for the first time, what right actually felt like under their feet was where it started. Everything else was just what followed. True strength doesn't ask to be seen. It simply shows up quietly, early, in the places where someone else needs it, and then gets back to work.